got to her. It wasn't the cold that got to her, which she's always said Chicago's colder than Fairbanks, Alaska. Temperature doesn't get as low, but it's dry and there's no wind up there.
Yeah.
Where Chicago's wet and quite windy. And
I've been on the lakefront in January, Eric.
Well, you know, it's like, and, but she was miserable the first year, and her boyfriend, Donald, to whom she is married and has been now for quite a while. I got two grandchildren. But she called Donald up and said went to a local Lutheran college because his mother was a Lutheran pastor. And she called him and said, if you don't move here, we're breaking up. So Donald wasn't all that thrilled with the college he was at. He said, sure. And so he moved to Alaska the next year. And about a year or two later, I was talking to Lizzie and asked her how she still liked Alaska. And she said, to be honest, I'm getting tired of it. I'd like to leave. But Donald loves it. And since I'm the one who made him come here, I can't very well insist that he leave. They wound up spending 5 years up there.
Well, I have to say, I would not be at all surprised to find that Luke is the one for Megan. And the good news is Sharon and I both like him a lot. The bad news is Michael doesn't. They went to high school together. I don't like him. But, we told him, we said, look, there's two girls, one of you,
Yeah, right. He's just the brother. He doesn't.
Yeah, you don't get to vote.
You never know. When Liz and Donald, they started going together when they were 15. And I remember looking at it saying, yeah, it's not going to, because what happened to me, And here it is 30 years later.
Okay, Luke and Megan were dating in the 9th grade.
Oh, really?
Dating is dating. Okay. 10th grade, we don't hear a word about Luke or the guy that Morgan had been hanging around with. And so we're like a month into the year. And finally, Sharon says, okay, what'd they do? And the girls kind of look at each other and they kind of hem and they haw. And then Megan looks at Mom and says, they're just not serious about their grades this year, and we're not putting up with that. Okay, so not a word about Luke all the way through the 10th grade. Okay, junior year, about 2 weeks in, when he had time to turn over that new leaf, all of a sudden we're hearing about Luke again. And we've been hearing about Luke ever since. So, like I say, Megan has a type. It's Luke.
There we go.
You know.
So this is a question that everybody had for both of you as well. How has being stuck at home during quarantine, COVID-19, all this lovely stuff going on in the world today, affected your writing process? Has it been more productive? Has it been more difficult?
Eric?
I found it's mixed. On the one hand, I'm certainly not distracted by travel or by too many other things. One thing, Lucille and I have done a lot more work on the garden than we didn't have in years past, which has improved the garden a lot. But in some ways, it gives you more time. In other ways, it's not exactly enervating, but I think I generally would do better if I was able to move around more. Let's put it that way. I don't feel like there's any huge difference. And insofar as there's been a difference, there are other factors involved that are a lot more important. The biggest one being I have not yet stopped cursing David for giving me a novel to work on that is thankless in so many ways.
It's not thankless. I really, really appreciate it.
This has been what I'm currently writing, although I've taken a bit of a break the last few weeks just because as I think many of you know, and if not, I'm inviting you all right now to come to the Ring of Fire convention, which is happening the weekend of October 8th through 11th. And David is one of the guests at that conference. It's partly on the 1632 series, but it spills over on other things. And it wound up never having organized a virtual convention before. I can tell you it's a lot trickier than it looks.
Virtually a whole new experience.
It is, and a steep learning curve. But it's actually, I think, going to go off quite well, but it's kind of preoccupied me. But the problem with the novel that David and I are working on now, which currently has a working title of Cloak of Alignment, which may change. I haven't been happy with any of the ones that come up with, and I'm not crazy about this one, but I'm less unhappy with it than others. They'll make the final decision. But here's the problem. Every other book in the Honorverse I've done with David, and there's been 3 now, plus 2, one short novel, 1 novella I've written. I've basically been following in his footsteps in the sense that the world was already created. All I had to do is figure out a story inside it. But this novel, we are actually treading on new ground. And if there were any justice in the world, he'd be writing the first draft instead of me. But
justice, what is this justice of which you speak?
But I'm doing the first draft, and it's interesting. It's not that I don't enjoy it, but there's a lot of rewriting involved. Yeah. I'm not used to really rewriting much because my first drafts are usually pretty close to what's going to be the final draft. But I'll write a few chapters, send it into David, and Tom Pope will look at it too. And then they'll come, oh, no, this will not work because of this. And it was like, who knew? And they'll say, we just figured it out. And so I have to go back and rework it. It's not that I haven't enjoyed it, but it's been slower than David. David and I usually work together pretty.
Yeah, usually, by this point in the writing process, time-wise, normally, Eric would already have finished his draft of his full portion of the novel, and I would have it sitting on my computer doing my part of it. I think one of the things that when Eric was mentioning that he's not traveling as much, Sharon and I usually travel a lot too. And I think that part of my problem right now may be that I'm used to that cycle in my writing. Yeah. I'm used to getting out of the office, going to a con. Every time I go to a con, I lose 2 weeks of writing because there's the travel time and then there's the getting back into it when I get back. But I think that kind of is a battery charging thing in some respects where the creativity is concerned. And I haven't had that. I maybe what I'm saying is that it's the sameness of the texture that is sort of stifling my creative juices to some extent. Like Eric, except my office is bigger than Eric's. Office envy is a terrible thing. But I mean, this is basically where I work every day. And so I'm out here every day. And when I get to take some time away from it, that's a good thing. And I think also having the girls off at college has been a factor, because there's been so much, it's like we lost 40% of our family interaction, right there with sports and everything else. And that's another thing that this whole lockdown has done. The girls lost their entire senior soccer season. They were joint captains of the team, et cetera. Boom, just gone. And that's been a hard adjustment. And I feel every time I think about it and say, oh, poor me, I'm thinking about the hourly wage earners, who are locked out and whatnot. And I'm saying, okay, look, I'm one of those salaried people, kind of thing. But it does have an effect on your ability to be creative, I think. And that's one of the things that I love about writing, is that sense of creating. You were talking about building worlds and characters. I think one of the reasons that my collaborations have been going better than my solo work right now is because I've been able to get that spark of, okay, we are sitting down, we're talking about how we're going to build this world, how we're going to build this story. And that is sort of a substitute for the travel and the cons that I'm not doing in terms of the dynamic of the way the process works for me.
So kind of along those lines, and this is for both of you again, this is kind of a two-part question, but Kasha and Zilwicki are the main characters in the stories when you guys write together, in the Honorverse anyway. How did you come up with those characters, and which one of you created them?
Well, Eric actually, Anton was created in one of my short stories.
No, it was in a novel, David. It was in a novel. It was,
Was
in
it?
the third. It was.
Oh, it was. It was. Yes, you're right.
It was in the short Victorious War.
Yes, it was in the short. Oh, by the way, talking about titles
Mm-hmm.
for books. Okay, do you know how that one finally got a title?
Probably involved Jim Bain, I would have.
Oh no.
No?
It involved Tony Weisskopf.
Oh, really?
Because it got a title because it was untitled, and it got a title when I discovered that Tony was referring to it in-house as "Honor Gets Laid." And I decided at that point I had to come up with a title. Okay, so I came up with a title. I had to sit down and really think hard, fast about what I was going to do with that. But I put Anton into that novel in a way which I think really encapsulated a lot of his personality, but not much of his background, except for the fact that he was Navy. And then Eric said, is there something that a Havenite agent and a Manticoran agent could agree to go squash even in the middle of the war? And I said, sure, genetic slavery. And then he started looking for a character from one of my novels that he could use, a secondary character who might be interesting. And he had a small problem, didn't you, Eric?
I did. I started with actually, it's a trick I learned from David. I've adopted it, which is he has a reputation for having a very high body count, and it's actually mostly smoke and mirrors because he doesn't actually kill off major characters very often. What he does in every novel is he builds up at least one secondary character to the point where you get invested in him, and then he kills that one off. And I started reading on Basilisk Station. I was looking for a character who would be suitable for me to use in the, in what I was going to write, which wound up being a short novel, and they kept dying off. So I finally got to the third book, and I ran across Anton Zilwicki. It's a very powerful scene. You only see him for like 3 pages. He's on a ship with his daughter, their very young daughter, and his wife is the commander of the small fleet that's escorting him. And they get ambushed, and she stays back to fight off the attackers. And they talk one last time, and they both know she's not going to survive. And I thought, this one's great. So I called him up and I said, did you kill off Anton Zilwicki later? And of course, he couldn't remember. He said, I'll have to think about it. I don't think so. And anyway, we eventually determined that he was still alive so I could use him. The origins of Kasha, I came up with Kasha. What happened there was David and I talk politics a lot, as will probably not come as a surprise to everyone. And at one point, he said to me, I can't remember how it came up, but I think I gave him a hard time about the character Pablo Young, probably. But he said, look, Eric, he said, I know the series is getting a little bit skewed in terms of my own preferences because of my own political views, probably a little bit too much to write. He said, so I'll tell you what, because we'd already agreed I'd write a story for him. He said, fine, you come up with a couple of attractive left-wing characters I can use. And he said, see what you can come up with. I said, okay. So the two I came up with, so I'll give you a liberal and a radical. How's that? And he said, okay. So the liberal was Catherine Montaigne. And I try to remember, David, I think I invented her. I don't think she ever appeared.
And I, when we talked about it, one of the things that I wanted was not so much somebody who was left, although that was important too, but I wanted a political character in Manticore that I hadn't created, that
Gotcha.
would have different DNA for
I know
going
what you mean.
forward.
Yeah. Okay.
And on Kasha, while we were kicking this back and forth, Eric made the excellent point, which I completely agree with, that if you look at the members of the original secret police and whatnot in the Soviet Union, you had a lot of very sincere, very committed, radical revolutionaries, not just reformers, who absolutely believed in what they were doing, and who had at that time every right to believe in what they were doing. This was pre-Stalin. This was not the cult of personality for Joseph Stalin. These were the guys who were dealing with a system that was corrupt, that was crumbling, and who were committed to doing something about it. And Victor is one of those guys, kind of born out of his time, when he believes in the revolution. He believes in what it says it wants to accomplish. And he, by God, makes it accomplish what it said it was going to accomplish, whether it wants to or not. So there. Okay. And that's one of the things I like him. Now, he's a little tiny bit bloodthirsty for my liking. You know, I don't like to write about characters who kill people, you understand. But I really, really like Victor a lot.
Well, I patterned him after a roughly 1919 Russian Civil War Czechos. And when the Czech was originally launched, it eventually evolved into the NKVD and then the KGB. It became something very monstrous. But
yes,
when it originated, there was, in fact, the white armies who were basically militaristic dictators, is what they were, parading and marching around. You know, they were brutal as all hell. It was a very brutal civil war on both sides. And you know, the original Chekists were not shooting people in the basements of the Lubyanka. They were out in the field. And that's what I, patterned Victor after. The thing that's funny is I liked him myself in the story, but he is pretty hard-edged, and I was kind of worried that, people wouldn't like him. And over the years, I've discovered people really like the character.
Well, Victor is, I think the thing that makes Victor work is that at his center, he is absolutely simple, in that he is a man of belief and conviction. And due to the circumstances under which he came to where he is, there's no give in him. There's no compromise. He is, like I think we've said at places in the book, he is as clean of purpose as a battle axe. Mm-hmm. And that's it. Now, the thing is that there are some other characters in the book, and some of them, those types, are going to be turning up in the one that Eric and I are working on now, who are just as clean of purpose, just as focused, and what they are devoted to is monstrous. Mm-hmm. And so they are monsters. It's kind of what Victor and Honor have in common is that under the wrong set of circumstances, either of them would be a monster, a nightmare.
Yeah, no, you're right about that.
Yeah, and they're committed to sort of different aspects of the same grand purpose. Mm-hmm. But without those governors that they've acquired, either one of them would be absolutely a nightmare.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. There's another aspect too, though, also about Victor, which I think I put it into the draft we're working on. There's one point where somebody says about him, I forgot the exact words, but he's unilaterally or unequivocally loyal to Haven, but he's not in the least bit tribal. And what's meant by that is that he's loyal to what he thinks Haven can be and should be, but if somebody screws with it, as he's done before, he will turn against that government. I mean, that's what he's like. Part of the reason I came up with the thing of having him in the secret police, there's a fact that very few people in the United States anyway know, which is that the Trotskyist movement, the left opposition, and Trotsky was expelled by Stalin in 1928, and they formed the left opposition to Stalinism. The one government agency they would recruit from was the KGB more than any other. And the reason was because KGB agents had to know the truth.
Yeah.
I mean, they were the intelligence, so they knew. And a whole lot of them got disgusted with it because of their own experience with it. So there are quite a few that came over.
So speaking of Victor, who created Tandy?
Huh?
Who created who?
Tandy.
I'm sorry.
Tandy.
So,
Who created who?
Tandy?
Oh, Tandy Palani.
Yeah.
oh, okay.
I created her. No, I created Tandy, and she's another interesting character who's hard-edged herself in a different kind of way. But we needed a character who had the training that she had in the Solarian Marines, and also was very close initially to Louis Rojac, because we needed to develop him as a character. And he's another tricky character to work with. And she was sort of the initial way of doing it, and that's why originally I just created her kind of as a plot device. But then I don't know how to put it. These stories, David and I talk a lot, and these stories, we work them out. When I say talk a lot, if you were to add together the exchange of correspondence before we start a novel, you're looking at several tens of thousands of words. I mean, I'm not sure how much. And so Tandy started as a plot device, but because of the way the plot unfolded, she winds up interacting with Victor Kasha. And at that point, I can't remember if it was me or David, it occurred to one of us or both of us talking that this would make an interesting romance to develop.
Oh, I was the one who said this would be an interesting romance. You were the one that injected the velvet ropes.
Oh, I'm the one who made it.
Yes. I'm just saying.
Okay, yeah, I remember that now. Yeah.
I thought you did that to me to get even with me for saying that you
No, honestly, it wasn't that. I actually did it just because I thought it was kind of amusing. And again, it's one of those things I was worried how readers would react to it, but so far I've never gotten any grief over it. I mean, it's pretty lighthearted. I mean,
it's very lighthearted.
It's hardly 50 Shades of Grey.
No. And this is a woman who could tie you up into a pretzel in a heartbeat.
That's part of what makes it work.
Yes.
That's part of what makes it work. Is that if she were not cooperative,
if it wasn't her idea,
But that's how she came about. And then after that, what happens with these characters is that they wind up very quickly becoming joint characters, because both David and I work with them, and he's used them in novels he's done on his own, without me being involved in it. And, the same thing happens with the 1632 series. It's, I remember once in Baines Bar, some smartass said he could tell exactly which sentences in 1633 I'd written and David had. Or which
good freaking luck.
So I said, okay. And I took the time, which is probably foolish on my part, to go through a chapter and put every sentence I'd written, either regular and David's in caps or the other way around. I remember how it did. And it's like a bowl of spaghetti. I mean, sometimes I'll write a whole chapter and David will write a whole chapter. A lot of times we just mix it up.
Well, a part of it is that because we can send manuscripts back and forth electronically, we actually are, in a lot of sentences, Eric began the sentence and I ended it, or it got modified in the process. The only person I know who can, with 90-degree accuracy, pick what I wrote and what someone else wrote out of a collaboration, and even she probably couldn't do it in the way that Eric and I collaborate, is my sister Kathy. She can say, this is what you wrote, that's what the other person wrote. But she's the only one, and I don't know how she does it, because sometimes I look at it and I can't remember
I
who
can't
wrote
either.
which.
A lot of times I can't
Yeah.
either.
But that's the way it works in a good collaboration.
Oh yeah, sure. That's
Yeah.
what you want. I mean, I can usually tell. I know pretty much, broadly speaking, which episodes you would have written and which episodes I would have written, because it's the content matter. I don't try to write big battle scenes.
I think probably I do more editing on Eric's text in the exchange process than he does on mine in the Honorverse. And when we were working in the 1632 universe, it was the other way around.
The other way around. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the way it is. Yeah. And also, it varies a great deal from one book to the next how much each one of us write. I wrote most of Crown of Slaves. But David wrote at least, probably more than I did, at Torture Freedom.
Yeah.
And Cauldron of Ghosts, pretty close to even, I think.
Yeah, this one so far is more Eric than me.
Well, so far, David. I mean,
yeah, but that's
there's going to be some big battle scenes I'm not even going to touch.
Yeah.
I'm just not going to touch them.
Well, Eric is getting to do all of the skullduggery scenes, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, but okay, fine, Eric, you can do those. I'll just blow up starships. That's what I do, Yeah.
What a bummer.
Oh, listen, okay, if you talk about blowing things up, okay, the Gordian Protocol and the Valkyrie Protocol, I have got to put Jacob Hollow on a really, really short leash about blowing up universes. That's just all there is to it,
So we have another combined question for you guys. What is the first thing that you both think about when you're planning a new world? Where do you start? What is your inspirations?
Collaboratively or individually?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Well, okay. I think it would be fair to say, Eric, that we have not created a collaborative. We're probably coming closest to it in this book. With the subset of it.
Within limits. It's still very much your universe.
Yeah.
I've never collaboratively created a universe. And I've done a lot of collaborative work.
Says Mr. 1632 himself.
Right?
No, I mean, it's not. Okay, first of all, I do a lot more collaborative writing in the 1632 universe than David does in the Honor Harrington universe, but there's a very good reason for that. The reason I can bring in 170 authors, is what we're up to now, into the 1632 universe, is there are two fundamental frameworks of the setting that are objectively set, not set by me. One of them is the actual history of the period. I did not create Oliver Cromwell. I did not create Gustavus Adolphus. They're real. You can read about them in history books. And the other is the technology, because the uptime technology is whatever the real town of Mannington had in the year 2000. That's the rule. If you can find it in Mannington, it's in Granville. The only exception is I did move the power plant closer because I needed to. But other than that, so that gives everybody an objective framework. If you were to try to do that in the Honor Harrington universe, David would go mad, because he would have to answer everything.
Yeah.
And it's just not possible. So that's why it's the same way with me. I don't do anything like that in my other collaborative writings. I did the Osiris series with David Drake, period. That was it.
So speaking of David Drake, Eric, what's the difference between writing with David Drake and writing with David Weber?
Well, the functional difference is enormous. With David Drake, he plots it, I write it. It's that simple. David Drake and I have done 7 novels together, and if you were to add his actual prose together, it would be about 1.5 pages of those 7 books. The reason is partly that's the way it was set up to begin with, but the main reason we continued that way you know, it's the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Well, you developed a very effective voice working together that
We
way.
did. And the other thing, though, is I think if David Drake and I tried to actually write a novel together, it would certainly put a strain on our friendship, because we just don't tell stories the same way. It's the same reason from a different angle. I don't try to write with Chuck Gannon because he and I don't tell stories the same way. And we would just be well, I had the experience of Mike Resnick of writing a novel together, and 2/3 of the way through the book, I was ready to strangle him. And Mike was a friend of mine. I mean, you know, it just, his way of telling a story just drove me bats, and I had to fit my, you know. So I finally, 2/3 of the way through, just said, Mike, I think we're getting each other's way. Why don't you just let me finish the book, and then you can do whatever you want with it. And that's how we finished it. David and I, Weber and I, write stories very much the same way. It's, you know, there are differences, but the way we tell a story and approach and think about it is very, very similar.
I think that's probably fair. I do collaborations with a smaller number of people, but in a larger number of universes than Eric does. By and large, 1632 is an exception in that it's me playing in somebody else's sandbox rather than me playing in my sandbox or one that I co-created from the ground up. Mm-hmm. And that puts some interesting constraints on doing it. But Eric and I are so comfortable working together that things have been grown in the Honorverse because of Eric's input, the characters that he's created, that I've incorporated, in incorporating their backstory into the universe. I've also built the backstory of the universe because of their addition, if you see what I'm saying. And I think some of the same in 1632 on the naval side. I think that part of it is that Eric and I are comfortable critiquing one another and being critiqued by one another. And that is not always an easy thing to do. And at least before the concussion, I think, we both tended to be the dive into the book and pound on it for hours at a time, in terms of the way that we got into what we were writing. And I think that gives us an ability to appreciate the other one's creative flow when we're sending the manuscript back and forth and we're looking at it. But basically, I'm just very comfortable working with Eric. I think probably the two most comfortable collaborations that I've had, collaborators that I've had, have been Eric and Jacob right now. In Jacob's case, it's because our areas of strength fill in so much. Eric and I are both historians. Mm-hmm. We're both interested in politics. We're both interested in how societies flow and grow and change. Okay, and so that informs what we write, and is one reason why I think we're comfortable writing together, even though we have strong political views, which we can actually discuss, which a lot of people don't seem to be able to do today. But that's part of the way the process works with us. In Jacob's case, what we've got is I'm the historian and the political thinker. He's the engineer. He's the, and so it's, the marriage works there because of the way in which the opposites interweave. Whereas the marriage works with Eric because of the way in which we have shared strengths and we understand where the other one is coming from.
Yeah, my relationship with Reich Spoor is very similar to what you're describing. Reich is the scientist and engineer and technician, and the first book we did together, Boundary, I remember I had to rewrite his entire draft that had anything to do with politics or and And the reason was that what Reich on his own likes to write, I actually am the one who sort of made him write hard SF, which he can do. But on left to his own, what he really likes to write is superhero fantasies. And his politics tended to be along that line. Anyway,
I
never
have to
mind.
tell you, my favorite solo thing that he's still done is
Oh, Princess Holy Aura? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
have you guys read that?
I have not, but you're not the only person I know. It's one of those books I got sitting there and I have to read. I mean, Reich and I have now written 6 books together, and we're working on a 7th, and I feel guilty that I haven't read it.
Well, anytime you see the cover with, the phone booth and the guy is pulling the shirt open and instead of the yellow S on his chest, you've got an anime princess,
Yeah.
it's going to be a strange book, and it is, but it is remarkably good. I recommend it to anybody out there. I have to say, most of his solo fiction has not really been up my alley.
Yeah.
This one, absolutely, for me, he knocked out of the park. And so that may say something about its quality.
He's a very good writer. He is, and it really does get down to a matter of taste. It's what kind of story you like, and but doing the hard SF novels I write with him, and I could not do a hard SF novel if I had to do it on my own. The amount of research I'd have to do is just so prohibitive that, I'd had the plot for Boundaries figured out 20, 30 years ago, but and once I ran into Reich, I realized I had a partner I could work with and do it. But it's that kind of partnership. I mean, he'll bring in something very different than I will.
That where you get into trouble in a collaboration, I think there are 2 things that can both be huge problems, and that is if you work at radically different paces and you're trying to exchange manuscripts and so forth, because of the fact that if you're the guy who writes faster, you're being pulled out of the flow by the silence from the other end while they do their part, or you're the guy who is feeling like, he's tailgating me, trying to get me to give him what I need. I think that can be a real problem. The other problem comes when, for whatever reason, you find out you're not headed for the same objective. And it can be because of a difference in how you're understanding the technology. It can be a difference in the understanding of the politics. And you can get into a situation where one of you is kind of having to force his natural storytelling into a conclusion or a channel that doesn't really work for you. And
well, that could be frustrating.
Well, it's frustrating, but it's also what draws readers to a given writer more than anything else is that writer's voice. It's the kind of stories that writer tells, but it's also the way in which he tells them, the way in which characters are built, the way in which you see into people's brains in the books. And if you're not on the same page about that, it doesn't mean you have to do it the same way, especially if you have divided the characters, which is essentially what Eric and I do, because then each character is true to himself or herself, because there's the person who created that character is writing most of the scenes in which you actually get revelations about the character, if you'll pardon the expression, the character's character. It doesn't necessarily have to be inside here either. It's watching how they interact with other people. But if you have people who have authors who have radically different notions about how you do that, that can be a problem because readers feel like they're being pulled out of the story every time they have to shift gears to the other voice, the other strand. And I think another big problem can come if this is kind of the converse of that. If one partner is being forced to conform to the other partner's writing voice, because then basically the one who's being forced to conform is doing a pastiche rather than speaking in his own voice and telling his own story. So you have to have that ability to fit comfortably together, but you always have to remember that what you're doing here is a fusion of more than one writer. And if you stomp all over your partner, you're not going to get his or her best work, no matter what. And in that case, you're shortchanging your writing partner, you're shortchanging your readership, and ultimately, I think you're shortchanging yourself, because you're depriving yourself of the very reason you wanted to write with that person in the first place.
Right. That
Yep.
makes absolute sense.
So what comes first, the world or the characters?
David, you want to take that first one?
I
know with me, it's neither one.
Yeah, I would say what comes first with me is, what story am I going to tell?
Yeah. The way I put it is, what's the basic conflict involved here, and do I care about it?
Yeah.
And if I could figure that out, and when I say the basic conflict, that can be very general, but I have to be able to figure out exactly how it fits this particular scenario. Then everything will start coming into place, and then the world and the characters sort of get built with each other at the same time.
Yeah, for me, it's okay. Mutineer's Moon. Okay. I'm sitting on my front porch in Greenville, South Carolina, one hot summer night, and I look up and here's this huge red moon coming up over the horizon. And I said to myself, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we don't have a moon at all? If that's actually a giant alien starship rising over the horizon? Ooh, shiny. And I was off. And that was the origin of Dahak and all the rest of it, because I had to explain why we had a starship that size orbiting this podunk out of the way planet, and why it was still here. And so somebody who doesn't believe in conspiracy theories of history wound up writing this grand conspiracy of history novel. For me, I usually have a feel for what I want the story to be about. And I usually have a start point and an end point of what I want to do in the story. But it took me a while to figure this out. It's not because I have a particular character that I'm looking at taking through the story. This is the story arc that I want to tell. This is the kind of story that I want to write. And then I start building a world in which that story can be told. And all I really have about the main characters at that point is a picture in my mind of, are they male? Are they female? You know, what is their personality like, in very broad strokes, very broad strokes. And it's as the story proceeds, like Eric is saying, you build as you go. And you're building both the universe and the character. I put a lot of thought into my universes before I actually start writing in them. Eric has seen my tech Bible on the Honorverse. And I do similar tech Bibles on almost everything that I'm writing. The one exception to that is the Norfressa series. And that's because that's basically a universe that I spent 30 years building when I was DMing war games. And so it's kind of like, yes, I know everything there's to know about that world already. Thank you very much. I think it would be a mistake for me to nail a world down too completely before I start writing the story, though. The main thing is, for me, the huge thing for me is continuity and logical consequences. Eric, I think, would agree with me that what's more important than what your characters can do almost is what they can't do.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah. That's what builds the conflict. That's what gives them the problems.
So in your opinion, David, is that kind of along the lines of how you came up with Pavel Young, one of your most famous villains? The psychological background of this man?
Well, Pavel, okay. Pavel was full born as a scummy predator. Okay. As far as his personality was concerned, I wasn't real worried about it because I was planning on killing him off at some point here, you know. And I have more trouble getting into my villains' heads than I do getting into my good characters' heads. With the exception of villains who are villains because they're true believers. Them I can handle. Okay. I mean, Oscar Saint-Just, who I think is one of the scariest characters I ever created. I understood exactly what was going on with him. Okay. He actually had these beliefs. He had a chieftain he'd given his loyalty to. And Oscar Saint-Just was Victor Kasha serving the dark side.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. Oscar Saint-Just is what Victor could have become under the wrong circumstances. Pavel is not. Pavel is just an emotionally crippled, sociopathic predator. And the key thing for me about him was understanding that he had zero sense of empathy. Once I understood that, I could build the character. He has zero sense of empathy. He is wealthy. He's privileged. He's used to abusing people because he can. And when somebody gets in his way and doesn't collapse the way they're supposed to, it's their fault, not his. And once you had that nailed down, it was like, yeah, I can write about him. I don't like to. I go take a shower after I write about him.
Take a shower after we read about him. So
yeah. Well, I do. Every so often I have to go back and reread the duel scene and say, okay, fine. I dealt with him. Honor and I dealt with him. It's okay. We're good.
So Eric, what's your process for creating a character? Where do you start? How do you work out a character?
I don't usually start with a character. The only time I could even say that was true is there's one sense in which the 1632 universe started with a character, but it was a collective character. I used to live in that part of West Virginia. I was, during my days, a political activist, and I got to know, I was never a member of the United Mine Workers Union, but I worked very closely with them, both then and later in Chicago. And I got to know that community, those areas, especially those small coal mining towns. And it just occurred to me, I think even before I went back, I had been writing when I was a young man, but I'd stopped once I got politically active, about the age of 21, seriously active, because you just can't do both at the same time. They're both too, anyway, never mind. But I didn't write.
They're too consuming, Eric.
Yeah, they're too consuming. So
Yeah.
I just didn't write for about 25 years. And when I went back to writing, it had always struck me, I don't know when the thought came to me, that a town like that would make a marvelous collective protagonist. But I didn't know what the story was. And what happened was that years later, David Drake and I were supposed to do a novel together, which never got written. It was based on a plot of his where a war in the near future breaks out between Vietnam and China's broken up into three warlord realms.
Warring states. Okay, I got you.
States, yeah. And the Vietnamese get into a war with the southern Chinese. And an alien band of mercenaries arrives and offers their services to the Vietnamese, working through an American expat who was a former Vietnam vet. And
wow.
But David did not develop the background of the aliens. They were, and I asked him, as I had done with the Belisarius series, because I'm the one who developed that whole complex background with the Indians and the Ethiopians. David had left that pretty blank. So I said, would you mind if I develop the background for these aliens? He said, no, go ahead. So I usually base these things on history. Real history is a place to start from. So I thought, well, what were the great periods of mercenary warfare? 30 Years' War. I hadn't read about the 30 Years' War in at least 30 years, but I went back and got C.V. Wedgwood's Classic History of the 30 Years' War, and I started reading it, and somewhere about a third of the way into it, it dawned on me this is the perfect setting for this coal mining town because that war was such a bloody, chaotic mess. Anyway, so that's the one story I've told where I started to collaborate with the characters. Well, in some degree, the Alexander and Heron started with the character of a cruise ship. It just struck me when I was on a cruise once with my wife that, boy, a cruise ship would make a great setting, for a novel if I could just figure out what it was, which I eventually did. But usually the way it starts is, in the case of the Belisari series, that was done on commission. Jim Bain asked me if I would, after he bought my first novel, he asked me, would you like to do a collaboration with David Drake? And I didn't know David. I read a few of his books, but I thought, well, I'd be an idiot not to jump at the chance. So I said, sure. And David sent me this very well worked out outline of his, and I'm sort of grappling with it. And then I finally get clear in my head that what happens is an intervention into the world of the Eastern Roman Empire by forces from the very far distant future, and one of which is human and one of which is kind of alien. And I realized the aliens were the good guys and the humans were the bad guys. And at that point, when I realized the conflict involved here goes back to something fundamental, which is how do you define humanity in the first place? Is it their origins and genetics and who they are, or is it what they do? And in the case of the Belisari series, the good guys are not human. In fact, they're actually genetically grown from a very deadly virus, but they have become human because of the fact they were created by the human race, and that's who educated and trained them and so forth. Whereas the villains are humans, but they are sort of people who perceive themselves as the perfect humans. It's ironic because in some ways they bear resemblance to David's villains in the Honor Harrington series.
I think one thing I think we both do, Eric, is we write the stories to discover the characters.
Yeah, that'd be a good way to put it. Yeah. I don't think you can start with a character, and the reason I don't think, or at least I don't, is because a character is what the character does, not a composite of personality traits. And you can't figure out what the character does until you figure out what they're going to do. And I start from there. And
I think of it as the character is the person the character becomes.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah.
And when I started the Honor Harrington books, by the time I was actually started writing on them, I knew a whole bunch about Honor that I didn't put in to the first couple of books. And that was because, to me, it's watching a character grow and change and develop that makes an ongoing storyline work. And so what I did was I kept the things that I knew about Honor that I hadn't told you about in Basilisk Station to peel back a little bit in the Short Victorious War, and then to peel back a little bit more in the Honor of the Queen, so that you were seeing the character grow and change because more aspects of the character were being revealed to you. And I was watching the character grow and change because of what she had done in the books while I was peeling the onion. See, there's the onion again, for you. And so by the time I had gotten to the end of revealing to you almost everything that I'd known about her to begin with, she was growing and changing for me as well. And so from there on, we were discovering the growth and change of her character together. Does that make sense?
It does. So is Honor coming out of retirement, or will her daughter be carrying on the tradition?
Honor is coming out of retirement briefly in the book that Eric is working on now, because if we don't let her come out of retirement in the book, then people will be looking for both of us with pitchforks and torches and ropes.
Well, they will be looking for David because
No, I'll say it was
I will
Eric's
be
fault.
the first
I
one
was
to
gonna
say he made me do it. You know?
I was gonna put Honor in there, but no, he left her out. And, trust me, this is one of those things where she's going to basically say to Elizabeth, about that retirement thing, okay? I'm moving that back, let's see, voyage time, about 6 months, you know, kind of thing. Yeah, I don't know how much I'm going to do with Honor personally, moving forward, because of how senior she's become. Okay, now I'm going to be. Trust me, the book that Eric is working on now that she's going to appear in is going to be hugely involved with Honor, and I'm going to be really, really deeply involved in where she's going and why she's getting there, because this is going to be hugely important to her, and I think because of that, it's going to be hugely important to the readers too. But I am thinking that after we wrap this part of the storyline, that she will go into a retirement mode. And if she comes back to be a participant in a future novel, the example I like to use is Lessa and Flar from the later Pern novels, when they're the Weir leaders and they're not out there, you know, going charging back through time to bring the Weirs forward, or that kind of thing, because they're too senior to do that. And yet their personalities are so dominant in the series as a whole that they're still sort of the frame for the current window into the series, if you see what I'm saying. So I think that's probably what's going to happen with Honor. I've told people the next solo novel that I want to write in the Honorverse would actually be the story of Alfred Harrington's Marine Service, in which you will find out that Honor is not the most dangerous member of her family. If any of you have read Beauty and the Beast, you get a little window into Teddy Bear Alfred, and where the teddy bear came from. And there is that little throwaway line that I've got in there at one point where Honor is saying to her parents, "Yes, I know where I got my temper from, Daddy." Okay,
Yeah.
when Alfred has been this calming presence, you know, all the way through, you're going like, "Oh no, it can't be that bad." It's like, "Oh yeah, it can't."
The structure of this book is going to be quite a bit, I think, like Cauldron of Ghosts, where I wrote pretty much, I think, close to the entire first half of that book, and David wrote by far the largest part of the second half. And the reason has to do with what's being taken up.
Yeah.
I can develop the setting. The initial part of the story's got a lot of skullduggery and this and that and the other thing, and I'm fine with that. The problem that we have working in the or I have working in the Honor Harrington universe is that once you get to the big battle scenes, be they naval or as we discovered in Cauldron and Ghost, same problem happens with land battles. The problem is that, depending on how you look at it, from my point of view, the obsessive anal retentive way that he and Tom Pope insist on hanging on every goddamn, anyway, never mind. You know, it's just, I can handle the short, small unit combat because that's pretty straightforward, but you get into these great big things and, you know, I remember getting a correction from Tom about what a kinetic energy weapon would really look like. And I was sitting there thinking, I'm dealing with crazy men, you know. They have designed what a kinetic energy weapon would look like.
Well,
anyway.
You got to know if you're going to describe it. I mean,
I know. Anyway, so that's what's going to happen in this book. What makes this book so tricky is that because of the way the series developed in the last few books, what David's original intent had been that Honor Harrington would die a heroic and glorious death at the end. I think it was in which book was it?
At all costs.
At all costs. Yeah.
The one where unfortunately I had to kill one of my favorite characters instead of her.
Yeah. And then that death would give the series a sort of automatic, say, 20-year gap before her offspring grows old enough to start a new set of adventures. And that got compressed, it got telescoped. And the problem that creates, though, is you still need that 20-year or so gap because things have moved faster than the Masons, than the alignment expected, which means they're not ready.
Yeah.
And they're really not. If the Grand Alliance can track them down and find out exactly who they are and where they are, they're toast. I mean, they're just toast at this point.
Yeah.
So we've got to stall. So David handed me the thankless task of, okay,
I appreciate it a great deal. It's not thankless.
It's really great and exciting, and the heroes fail. So the gambit we're using, we pretty well swiped wholesale from Doc Smith, which is, these are our plurins.
If you're gonna steal from the best. I mean, my God.
It turns out Helmuth was actually not speaking for Boscone, but by the end of the book, in this book, our equivalent of Helmuth is going to get, well, their collective just desserts. But it's a tricky book to write.
Well, this is the mechanism that we're using was always there in the back of my brain. Okay, I mean, if you look at how I had structured the onion going forward, this was always kind of an ultimate fallback position, but I hadn't worked it out in any detail because I didn't expect to need it, if you see what I'm saying. Which is why Eric is getting to do a lot of world building here. In my since Doc Ed's been brought up, in my original visualization of the Cosmic All, the person who delivered Honor's ultimatum to the Solarian League was Mike Hinkey, who instead got to conquer Mesa in the new dispensation. But she was there for her friend Honor, and one of her staff officers was Honor's kid. Another one of Honor's children was commanding a ship in the formation, etc. So I got the resolution to the war against the Solarian League that I wanted, but I didn't get there the way I'd intended to get there. And that created some issues for the way the story worked out, and had a lot to do with where Eric and I are picking up for this book. Okay. But I can see places to take Honor's children in future novels. On the other hand, I'm 67 in October. And so I'm kind of a little leery about launching any more, 12-volume series at this point. And when I launch a 3-volume series, it turns into a 9-volume series. So, you kind of like, one of the reasons that I like what Jacob and I are doing in the Gordian Protocol universe is that it's an open-ended series, but it's not a story arc. It is a case of one book leads to another book rather than having a planned trajectory that I have to get from point A to point B to. And so hopefully each book will have a satisfying conclusion that will leave you wanting another novel, but that doesn't have those plot strands that are clearly not tied off, that are necessary to a long-running series with an internal story arc.
So what is, and you can both answer this, give us one scene, character, section that if you could go back and rewrite it, you would.
Well, I don't know, since I'm a perfect writer, I don't have any of those.
That's
You know,
great.
yeah. Well, you notice Sharon isn't here, so I could say that,
Have you had any water lately, David?
Mm. Well, I don't like wet shoes, so I don't walk across the swimming pool very often. Um, character that
Or a
I
scene?
I can't really think of a character or a scene that I carry around with me as, gee, I wish I'd done that differently. There are some, and there are more of them in the compressed version of the timeline that I wound up with in the Honorverse, that I'm not totally satisfied with. But the reason I'm not satisfied with them is that I was having to kind of get my feet back under me when the originally planned storyline, the originally planned sequence, um, uh, had to be so thoroughly recast. I mean, I hadn't planned on letting destroyers curb stomp battle cruisers, and I had to figure out, okay, where do I go from here to make this compelling to the reader? If the reader expects a destroyer to take out a battleship, he's going to be like, okay, fine, I can skip the battle scene. So there had to be something else in there. And I'm satisfied with what I did, but I'm not satisfied that I did what I had intended to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now there are scenes that if I go back and I look at them, I think like, well, maybe I could have tweaked that. I could have done that a little bit better or whatever. But one thing you have to learn as a writer is to be fair with yourself. When you look back at something you wrote, in my case, 30 years ago now, and you see where you are now and you say, boy, I could have done that better. You have to say to yourself, but could you have done it better then? My favorite book that Eric ever wrote, I think for most of us, the book that we first meet a writer that we really like in becomes our gold standard for that writer, even if we realize that technically later books are better. Because it's like the ships coming overhead in Star Wars, the first movie.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you're sitting in the theater and that happens for the first time ever, if you're old enough to remember that. You can never recapture that. And even movies that are just as, great, blah, 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 they don't have the impact that that one did. I think it's the same way with a writer that you really like. But my favorite was your first novel.
Yeah, Mother of Demons. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you told me that. It doesn't surprise me actually because David and I have a number of political differences. That will come as no surprise to anyone who knows either one of us. But there are a number of things that are fundamental we agree on, and one of it is the way we look at human history and the stance we think you have to take, and that. There's a way in which Mother of Demons is sort of my credo. It wasn't actually the first novel I wrote. It was the second one I wrote, but it was the first one I wrote. I started as a very young person. It's quirky. But when
was that The Strangler?
It's The Strangler and Forward the Mage. They actually wound up becoming 2 books. Yeah, that goes back to when I was 22 years old. And people have asked me, well, what's that book? And I said, the best way I can describe it is that it's Karl Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 turned into comic fantasy, and which is actually accurate. I can even show you where it is, but it's hard to describe. I did it. Anyway, Mother of Demons I wrote when I was 40. How old was I? 93. No, I was older than that. I was 46. And it's sort of my credo. It's what I believe. It's sort of I lay out how I think you have to look at human history. And there's a very real way in which everything I've written since is kind of just an illumination of it or exploring that in different ways. I reread it about 6 years ago. And if I were writing it now, the prose would be rather different in some ways. Jim Bain criticized me. He said, you have a habit of trying to swing for the fences all the time. And I knew what he meant. And if you go back and read that book, it's overly melodramatic in places. The prose is there's a lot more inner thoughts than I would use today. So there's a lot of changes, but to go back to the question you asked originally, the reason, I don't know how to put it, I thought about it, I thought, I'm not going to rewrite this. This is, this is what I did when I wrote it, and the hell with it. I think of this as the 97% rule I follow, and when I've told this to people, I've gotten a few people give me a hard time about it. And the 97% rule is this, is that I turn in a manuscript when I think it's about 97% as good as it could be. And then somebody says, oh, you're not trying to get it. I said, no, the reason is because reaching that last 3% is like trying to reach the speed of light. You'd put more and more and more work and get less and less and less out of it. And screw it, at a certain point, there's a different story I want to tell.
Yeah, but it's you have to turn story A loose to make room for story B.
Story B, that's it. And I know Ernest Hemingway once bragged that he rewrote Farewell to Arms 39 times. I'm willing to bet the third or fourth draft was the best one. Can't prove it because they've disappeared. Yeah. But, after a while, you're just second guessing yourself forever. And it's not worth it.
My problem is less rewrite than tweak. I could sit there and tweak a manuscript forever.
Sure.
Looking for the word I want or something like that. I have to let go. Tony and I are actually thinking about doing a substantial re-edit on War of Honor. War of Honor, there were a lot of things that went wrong in the mechanical process on that book. And one of the things that went wrong was I did not have time to do the final edit on it. Usually in the final edit, I'll squeeze out maybe between 20 and 25% of the original word count gets squeezed out in the final edit. That's where I'm removing duplicating scenes and tightening and everything. And there were several problems, including issues with completing the Shiva option that ate into my time. And then Simon & Schuster, they were like, okay, well, we want you to go ahead and finish the book so that we can do like arcs, but it's okay because you can change it if you need to after that. It's not cast in stone. And so I finished the book, and then I never had time to go back and tidy it up the way that it needed to be tidied up. So we are thinking about doing, War of Honor, the director's cut, which would probably be 30,000 words shorter.
It could use it. You asked me to read the manuscript for that very reason, because you were short of time, and you asked me to read it and tell you, And what I told you at the time was, look, it's too long. You should cut 10 to 15% of it. But the problem is you're under the gun, which you were. I remember that. I mean, this was one of those. It would, it's one thing to turn in a manuscript at the, sort of last minute. It's another thing to miss the last minute, because then it's really, especially a book like this, because it's the Honor Harrington series, his main book's it's a best-selling series, and it would really hammer the publishing on it. But what I told David, I said, yeah, it could use it, but here's the other cold, hard truth. People who complain about a 270,000 word book are going to bitch at you for 300,000. I mean, people who are going to complain because it's 300,000 words are going to complain because it's 270,000. Right. So, the truth is people like your writing and follow it. It's wordier than it should be, but it's not going to be that big disaster if you do it. It would be improved with an edit. There's no doubt about it. But
I think most of us are like, David, when's the next thing?
I'm sorry?
Love Dave. I said, I think most of us are like, when's the next thing coming?
Yeah, I mean, right. It's
okay. Not having enough time to write all the stories you want to tell is a better problem to have
Oh,
than
yeah. way
having
better.
time that you have to come up with a story for and you can't think of anything you want to write about.
Yeah,
But I mean,
that's, yeah.
I would,
Go ahead, David.
yeah. When Roger Zelazny died, I was one of the people who knew that he had cancer. Most people did not. And I knew because Jane Linsgold was a dear friend of mine and we could talk, if you know what I'm saying. But he had not told most of his close personal friends because he thought he was going to beat it, because he didn't want them to be thinking, oh, my poor friend Roger. And also, frankly, to protect his employability while this was going on. So the result was that George Martin was a close friend of his, and it came at George like totally cold. Okay. So for various reasons, Jane was not allowed to attend Roger's funeral. And Fred and Joan Saberhagen hosted what you might call a posthumous wake kind of thing. I flew out from South Carolina for it. It was great. But we moved from the Saberhagens to Melinda Snodgrass's house after after several hours. And I drove over with George. I rode over with George. George was driving. And we're driving, and he says, I can't believe he's gone, And I said, yeah, I know. And he says, but, he wasn't done yet. Yeah, no, I said, it's not like he didn't have a chance to show the world what he could do. He's the only man I knew who had like 5 Hugos and 5 Nebulas, okay, sitting on a shelf in his study. I said, it's not like he didn't show people what he could do. I mean, I think Roger was one of the greatest stylists of the 20th century, writing in the English language. But George says to me, he says, but he wasn't done. And I said, George, Roger could have been 98 when he died, and he wouldn't have been done yet.
Right.
Okay, that's the way that he was. It was kind of like Jack Williamson. Okay, older than God and still writing. And I'm hoping that that will be the case with me, but I'm also hoping that if I reach a point at which, because of a combination of like face plants into floors and whatnot, that I'm no longer able to do quality work.
Don't do that, David.
Yeah,
Well,
don't
I'm
do-
not planning on it. Okay. But I wasn't
buy you
planning on
David.
it the first time. I'm
will
a
buy you David.
spontaneous kind of guy. Okay. I go through life improvising. Sometimes it works, sometimes it
We're
doesn't.
gonna get him some bubble wrap.
Thank you. Sharon's already talking about that. But the point is that there are two ways to look at it when you have been around as long as I have. And that is, you can say to yourself, look, I've earned the right to do whatever the hell I want to do in the next book. I paid my dues. I've, done everything. I can do whatever the hell I want. And the other side is, yeah, I can do whatever the hell I want, but what I want to do is quality writing. And if I can't do that anymore, then I need to find a designated driver and become Miss Daisy. Okay, and let Morgan Freeman drive me around. And that's, I'll be honest, one of the reasons that I'm doing as many collaborations as I'm doing. I got a lot of reasons, but if you'll notice who I'm doing most of them with right now, they're relative newcomers. And that is in part because I'm into the pay it forward mode at this point. I mean, Eric can tell you, you reach a certain point where you realize that what you possess is a skill set that is perishable, because ultimately you will perish.
Mhm.
And if you can share that, if you can pass that on to people who you think have the ability to profit from it, to save them a little time in acquiring the same skills, I think you have a responsibility to your craft to do that.
That was
That's
one
one
of
of
the questions that folks had asked us to ask you was, how do you feel about the next generation of authors
Mhm.
coming in, and how do you pass on your experience, your knowledge, your fabulousness to the next?
Oh, wow. Eric, our fabulousness.
You
Kind of,
guys are fabulous.
Yes,
Yeah,
we're the Fab Two.
Really fabulous.
yeah, please don't say that within hearing of my wife or daughter.
Yeah.
Lori, got
Oh,
that?
cool now.
Actually, completely to my surprise, I wasn't expecting this at all, but I wound up doing a lot of it because I now have my own publishing house, and it's been expanding rapidly. And one of the things, and it's an actually unique publishing house because it's actually two, one built on top of the other. The reason I launched it in the first place because there are so many stories being written in the Ring of Fire universe that Baen Books didn't begin to have room for them.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they were worth publishing. So, I figured, what the hell? I mean, I'm well enough established. I could create my own publishing house. So that's why we set it up.
And it's a lot easier to do in
Nowadays,
the
yeah.
electronic universe.
Oh yeah, it's a whole different ballgame now. And then we realized, myself and my close associates, that we actually had a publishing house. So there's no reason we couldn't just use it in general. And we're using it partly to, what happens is the 1632 series books all make money. We've published 28, and so far 24 of them have covered their own costs and are now generating money. 3 of them will within the next year, and there's one run for the litter I think may not manage to quite cover its own cost. And then we've got 50 books that only 3 of which have covered their own costs, and I wrote one of them. But others will. It's just going to take time.
Yeah.
I can sustain those others because of the success of 1632 series. So we're looking for 2 things. One is new writers, and they can be whatever age. We just published first novel by Shoshana Edwards, who's 76 years old, or Nathan Dodge, for that matter, who's 80. But others are young writers. And the other thing is we're providing a place for stories and writers. We're starting to publish Cecilia Holland, which I'm pleased with, immensely pleased with, and she seems happy too. And for those of you who don't know her, she's an historical writer and terrific one. And for whatever reason, I guess she's having trouble getting published now. But I will publish anything of hers that she can. We just published a new novel by her, but she's also getting a lot of her past works that she can get out back to her and turning over to us.
I think one of the things that the ease of self-publishing and whatnot, one of the negative consequences of it is that you don't have as much of the apprenticeship with an experienced editor, and I'm not talking about your personal editor. I'm not even talking about your agent. I'm talking about somebody who tells you this has to be changed for us to publish the book. Because you have to learn your craft. Okay, if you're self-published, Sharon used to say, she used to coach synchro swimming, and she used to say, practice makes perfect only if you practice perfectly. And if you don't have that editorial input, if you don't have Jimmy Cricket sitting on your shoulder and saying, this is not, this isn't the best you can do, or I've got a problem with this scene that you have to work out, then you can get very practiced at doing it wrong. And I think it's a lot easier to do that if you're self-published, because you will find people who like what you're doing, even if what you're doing isn't the best you could do. But it's sort of an example of limiting what you can grow into because the environment in which you're growing isn't challenging enough.
Yeah, what happens with self-published authors, and I know I've gotten to know quite a few. There are a few very famous success stories, Hugh Howey and and Amanda Hocking, Yeah, those are the ones you hear about, and somebody wins the lottery too. But for the vast majority of self-published authors, don't get anywhere. And the ones who do make a success out of it, if you talk to them, usually are ones who just adopt a brutal writing schedule. Essentially, they publish a new novel every month.
Yeah.
And because you have to generate that kind of output to keep readership. And,
Yes.
and that produces a certain kind of writing. It produces, if you're good, it'll produce a Murray Leinster at his best, which is you basically write the same novel over and over and over again. You just keep filing off the serial numbers. And it's absolutely true that there are a few writers who can just do it all from pure talent right from scratch, but there are very few and far between. The second thing is, let me just say one last thing, Dave, will shut up. The second thing is, there's a lot of mythology about self-publishing. I mean, I hear that, well, I can keep all the money. No, you can't. You're going to have to pay a good artist hundreds of dollars to do a cover. And if you don't have a good cover, you're an idiot. You're going to have to pay a professional copyeditor or proofreader to read your manuscript. You're going to have to get somebody who knows the skills of putting a book together. In case you don't know, it's not that simple. And Amazon won't accept it if you don't do this, this, and this, and this. Do you know how to do all that? Oh, that's the skill set you've got to learn. All this takes you time and effort, which you could spend writing. So what happens is, I was curious, I published a short novel by David Gerald, which he wrote for me many, many years ago when I was editing Jim Bain's Universe. I always liked the story. And I asked him a couple of years ago, if it was available. He said, well, I'm self-publishing it, but I'll give it to you. And we've been publishing it. And I asked him just about 2 weeks ago, I said, I'm curious, how much money are you getting from me getting 50% compared to what you were getting when you were self-publishing it? And he said, oh, I get a lot more from you. And there's a lot of reasons for it. First of all, he had a pretty lousy cover. Secondly, he wasn't getting traffic particularly, because if you're one author and you're trying to generate traffic, there's nothing particularly drawing people to you, because to draw people to a site, you got to have new material all the time. And so, yeah, I don't recommend self-publishing. There's one exception, and that is if you're an established, especially a well-established writer, self-publishing can be great because it gives you flexibility and freedom. This poster behind the wall is a novel that I published through my own publishing house. And the reason was I offered it to Toni Weisskopf at Bain Books, and she didn't like it the way it was. She wanted a couple of major changes. I understood why she wanted the changes. It wasn't like I thought she was nuts or anything. I just didn't want to do it. I took it over to Jen Gunnels at Tor, and she had pretty much exactly the same reaction Toni did. So I then went and talked to my two co-authors and said, okay, here's the way it is. If we want to get this published through a major, commercial publisher, we're going to have to do a pretty major rewrite of it. And they had the same attitude I did. We liked the way it was. We just didn't want to change it. Okay, in my position today, I can publish it myself, and it's not making as much money, but it's doing okay.
Yeah.
But if you're starting off, no, don't do it.
Well, I think I tell people that the really great thing about electronic books and self-publishing is that you get to read a whole bunch of stuff that you wouldn't have gotten to read otherwise. And the worst thing about it is you get to read a whole bunch of stuff that you wouldn't have otherwise. Okay. And actually, if you're smart, you stop, be like 4 pages into some of it. Okay. But by the same token, I've seen stuff from traditional publishing houses where you kind of go, say, what? I have a book that I used to carry around to cons with me and demonstrate how not to write a novel with. The guy is an Australian, and he's got the last time I looked, he's got 9-10 books out, and he's been a bestseller in Australia. And I'm like, how? Kind of thing. I guess, it's standing on their heads down there or something. I don't know. But I think that what I think of as one of the drawbacks of ebooks, you were talking about output, Eric.
Mhm.
I think of them as 21st century pulps. Okay?
Yeah.
Because you have to churn it out. You have to churn it out. You have
If
to
you're
churn
trying to
it out.
make a living off of that kind of publishing, yes, you really
Yeah.
do.
Now, if you look at somebody like Chris Kennedy, in a lot of ways, what Chris does is kind of the pulps, in that there's so much output from all of his authors, but he's managed to set up a spinal column for it. And there are a lot of people out there who are like, yes, I need my nickel bag. Okay. I just, let me just insert the novel intravenously, kind of thing. And for someone who is that voracious a consumer of that particular writer or whatever, the publication schedule for e-publishing is a perfect fit. I could not possibly do that, because, well, the only way I could do it would be to do it as serialization.
Hmm.
Okay, this is the first third of the book. You'll have to drop in like 2 months from now for the second third, etc. And I'm thinking that might be a successful model for some writers, to do it on that basis. But I'm in the problem. I'm in the position of having more things to write that traditional publishers are willing to publish,
Yeah.
than I'm going to have time to get to before. Do you ever read the book The Plague Dogs,
No.
by the same guy who wrote Watership Down?
Yep.
Mm-mm.
It's a very good book, but there's one of the characters in it is he's going to keep running till the dark comes down. That's how he's visualizing his life. And that's kind of how I visualize my writing. Okay, I'm going to keep right on writing until the dark comes down. Harry Chapin was one of my favorite musicians, and I have one of his albums, and there's a outtake from an interview that he had, and he's talking about his grandfather. And he says his grandfather was an illustrator, and he illustrated a lot of, oh, what's his name? Not Howard Pyle. Crap, I can't remember the author now. But he'd illustrated a lot of his books. And he said his grandfather said, he said, Harry, he said, there's two kinds of tired. Okay. He said, I always wanted to be an illustrator. It's what I wanted to do. And a lot of what I've done here has been just great. He said, but there's two kinds of tired. And one kind of tired happens on a day when you realize you got a lot done, but you fought other people's battles, you did other people's stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's bad tired. So the good tired, conversely, could be a day when you don't get very much done at all, but you fought your battles. You were pursuing your goals. And he said, and when you hit the pillow at night, you settle easy. And he said, that's my life. And I'm ready to hit the pillow and settle easy. Okay? That's what I want to be able to say when the time comes. I want to be able to say that about my books. I want to be able to say that about my kids. I want to be able to say that about what I have done or not done in my life. Will I have regrets? Hell yeah, I'll have regrets. There are things I've done I wish I hadn't done. There are things I wish I'd done that I never got around to.
So
But
speaking of things that we're getting around to, David, inquiring minds want to know. We've all, or well, a lot of us have seen some of your interviews that are out there on YouTube. What's going on with the TV show? And I mean, the characters have been cast. And is there some?
What's going on with the TV show right now is 2020. The entire process got derailed. Where the folks who bought the option. They bought a, I think it was a 1-year option in which they were supposed to produce a script, and then they were supposed to find, shop it to the producers. And the script hasn't gotten written, and so obviously there's been no shopping around. The guy who bought the option wants us to give him another 6 months for free because of COVID. And I told them that they could have 30 days for free, and if they wanted to go more than that, that they were going to have to put some money up to put some skin in the game. At the moment, we are waiting to see whether or not they're going to do so. Now, we've had 3 more inquiries about it from other folks, and there is, by the way, a script for Path of the Fury, which is being shopped around to various movie producers right now. I have no idea what's going to come of that. Vince Gerardis is my guy in Hollywood, and he is of the opinion that eventually somebody is going to pick up the Honorverse and do something with it, if only because of its size and the readership. And there are very, very few universes out there that have something like the TRMN attached to it, and they're more common in movies and television than they are in literary fiction. And that is a factor that Eric is not Eric, Vince. I'm sorry, Eric. I looked down and there you were, and you distracted me.
No, it's my fault.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. But where and when, I don't know. I'm sort of like, okay, is this going to be Jenny Heinlein, Sharon Rice Weber running the show? But
because TRMN membership is going to explode when that starts.
Well, I think probably yes. If the movie's made or the TV series is made and it's done right, I think yes. I want to be sufficiently involved in any project like that to be able to shape but not control.
That's all you're going to have anyway,
Yeah.
no matter what. You're not going to. I've had fans tell me, make sure you keep control of the. I finally got a little fed up, but I said, you know how much it costs to produce one TV episode? Somewhere between $3 and $5 million. So you want me to tell somebody to spend $3 or $5 million on something and I control it?
Right?
I said, why does the commie have to keep explaining to people how capitalism works? I mean, no, I wouldn't do it. Neither would you. What
okay,
you want
morally,
to be able to do is shape it. You want that.
Morally, if you sell somebody the right to do to do a series based on your work, okay, you have zero financial risk.
Right.
Okay. The worst that's going to happen is that it doesn't make money and you don't get paid. All right. But the folks who are putting it together, who are being out of pocket to do the casting, the production, the direction, the distribution, the whole 9 yards, they have to be able to do it in a way that they expect it to work. And you can tell them, and I would tell them, look, I think this needs to be emphasized more or that needs to be emphasized more. But at the end of the day, they have a legal right, they have a moral right, and they have an ethical right to make the decisions that they think need to be made. And if you don't think they're going to make the right ones, then they're not the ones that you should sell it to in the first place. Okay.
I'm even more callous than you are, David, because it's look, even if they screw it up, here's the truth. The real benefit financially to an author to having a movie or or a TV series made of their work is what it does to book sales. Because it cranks them up another plateau. And the thing about book sales is they're very conservative, which is an absolute bitch if you're starting off, because people don't know who you are and readers are conservative. There's so many books out there, they can't experiment that much. But if you
And it's gotten worse.
Huh? Oh,
It's
I know it's
gotten worse
gotten
with ebooks. Yeah.
Ebooks makes it even worse. If you rise above that and people can see you, you will get readers, and some percentage of them are going to like you. And if you get that high up, where there's the illustration, by the way, is Jim Butcher. They made a 13 episode season out of the Dresden Files a few years ago. It was lousy, which it was, and it put his sales way up. I mean, you know, and then they're now redoing it, and it's going to be, I think, done right. One thing, they cast it properly. Yeah. They're going to get Adam Driver to play. Last I heard, Adam Driver is scheduled to play Harry Dresden, which that would work. My experience was like David's. I mean, they had the option. It was looking good for a while, and then it fell through. And now 2020's hit, and everything is closed down. There's a couple different people approach me. I'm talking to them. I'm actually considering just setting up my own development company, and just, you know, with some people I know who know stuff, including one of them is actually coming to. He's coming to the convention. Aaron Samwell, he's already been on one panel. He's going to be on another one tomorrow. We'll see what happens. But I told this to my family from day one, because they're all moving. I said, you know, that industry, you don't count your chickens till they've hatched and had chickens of their own. Yeah. You know, it's just the way it is. And I think, go ahead, David. I'm sorry.
I think one thing that's likely to happen coming out of the flupocalypse is going to be that there's a lot of stuff that's been on hold that they're already committed to, that they're going to have to get up and running again. But I think what you're probably going to be looking at is a Python lump that has to work its way through before new projects are going to get much traction. But successful production companies are always looking for what they're going to do next.
Well, I have to. Sure.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I don't know, you know, what consequences the hyper partisanship we're looking at in the U.S. right now is going to have on the entertainment industry. I mean, I have the occasional dumpster fires on Facebook, and somebody said to me one time, they said, "Why is that?" And I said, "Well, I think it's because I try to play fair in the books, and so I have folks on the left and folks on the right who read my books, who probably wouldn't talk to each other very much if they didn't. And when I put something up on Facebook, both sides are looking at it. And you know, I may be the voice of sweet reason out there while I'm talking about this, but when the fellow travelers weigh in, it can get kind of messy. And I feel like in some ways that's kind of an allegory for where we are as a nation right now. I mean, you know, my God. I mean, I have people who are like, well, I'm sorry, your safe hold book is with Tor because I'm not going to buy anything from them because they're this, that, and the other. And I have people who's like, well, you know, I wish your Honor Harrington series was with Tor because I ain't going to buy a book from Bain. And I'm sitting there going, you know, in the kingdom of the one-eyed man, you're blind. Okay, I'm sorry.
Look, this, I can't tell you how many times I've run into some fan, not fan of mine, but just fan who is astonished to discover I'm not right wing because I publish through Bain Books. Yeah, yeah. And I like to point out to them, which comes as a shock to them, that I am Bain's most published author of new titles over the last 20 years. Yeah. David would be, except that, you know, he went over to Tor. And
sorry.
If he were still writing just through Bain, he'd have a bigger output than I do. But and if you counted reprints, David Drake would. But as far as new titles go to Bain's published, the Socialist has written more than anybody else that published it. But it doesn't matter. People know what they know, and they don't want to be confused with the facts.
And you're not the only person writing for Bain who is considerably to the left of what most folks think of Bain
I
as
am
doing.
probably to the left of just about anybody in science fiction. The only people who could compete with me would be Stephen Bruce or China Miéville. But Misty Lackey's very far,
Mhm.
definitely to the left, and she's
Yep.
one of the major authors.
Yep.
But it's because of she doesn't write political type stories, so people don't think of her politically the way they do
Yeah.
you or me.
Yeah.
And I just got that old saying, I can handle my enemies, God help me from my friends.
Oh, Joyce.
And, it's just,
What's worse is when somebody decides that you're their friend when you don't even know them. I mean, I have had people who have made assumptions about me based on how they read my work
right.
that are scary.
Oh, yeah. No,
Okay.
I know.
I mean, I got people who think I'm to the right of Attila the Hun, which I am, but in a nice way.
Yeah, you're nice about it. No, that's true.
Yeah, but I mean, that's like I got no time for stormtroopers, whether they're in brown shirts or black shirts or anything else. Okay.
David, you have the misfortune of being a conservative in a world, at least in the United States, where the term conservatives does not mean what people think. It's like the old thing in The Princess Bride. That word you keep using, I don't think
Yeah.
what you think it means.
Inconceivable.
And I've always got along fine with conservatives. I was one myself when I was a teenager. And when I say I was one, I don't mean casually. I read the Reflections of the
Yep.
Revolution in France 3 times.
Yep.
I read Russell Kirk, didn't like him. I read how the guy I do like a lot, Peter Viereck, who's an excellent author on politics, and he's conservative.
Mhm.
And then I hear people say I'm conservative, and it's like, no, you're not.
Well, I think
You don't even know what the word means.
I think it cuts both ways. I think
no
the
kidding.
same thing is definitely true on the left. I tell people, I'm a 1960s hard left liberal. Okay, not a socialist. I was raised in the 60s. Okay, and I have the same basic value set that I had then. I mean, you're talking to somebody's mom was the founding member of the Urban League in Greenville, South Carolina.
Yeah, no, I know what you're.
Worked black politicians, the whole 9 yards. But it's the political tides move on.
Yeah, that's
okay. And I think it's not at all uncommon for one generation's flaming liberal to be the next generation's conservative, as in not necessarily reactionary, but conservative. And I think I go back to Winston Churchill's comment.
the famous saying. Was it him? The one where if you're not a liberal,
if you are not
if
a man is not a liberal at 20, he has no heart. If he is not a conservative at 40, he has no brain.
Right. Yeah. I think it was Churchill.
So I'm going to interrupt you guys for just a second. So
you're going to make us talk about books again?
No. I'm not. Because we've kind of gotten through most of the questions that folks had asked. So I just wanted to let you know that it's 9:00 my time, which means it's later than that your time. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave everybody muted, but allow people to unmute if they want to. And David and Eric, because we usually just spend some time just chit-chatting. So David and Eric, you're welcome to stay and keep talking, and we would love to have you do that for as long as you like to. We've been on here, just so you know, as late as midnight, my time. So you are welcome to stay as long as you'd like, and we are happy to keep listening to you, so continue the conversation. But I just wanted to let you know that it's 9:00 my time, so I don't want to keep you guys any later than you want to be here, so I'm going to just unmute. I'm going to keep everybody muted, but if you guys will be able to unmute yourself to ask a question if you want.
Sure.
Okay. Well, I need to eventually go find some supper. But that's okay because I ate a late lunch. I can hang for a little longer.
As long as you want to.
Lucille has a
You're
question.
awesome.
Lucille has a question.
Lucille has a question,
Mhm.
and she wants to know what is the proper attire for, she's the Baroness of someplace. And she wants to know what she's supposed to wear. So
Clothes.
I said I had no idea, because I don't know what the non-military, the civilian dress code is for Manticore, but
Well, see, here's the thing about Manticore. Okay, Manticore is a very cosmopolitan society.
mhm.
Okay, and they have all of these scores of planets of fashion to look at.
So she can wear
Okay.
pretty much anything she wants.
Yeah, the only thing really on Manticore that's been specified as being a set standard style is court dress. And even court dress, I mean, it's kind of like, okay, tuxedo.
Mhm.
Have you seen the variations that can be rung on tuxedo?
Or the
Okay.
formals you can put a lady in, the gowns. Ooh, the gowns.
Yes.
Ooh, the
yes.
gowns.
Grayson tends to be more codified
Yeah, I
on
would
what
think so.
on what fashion is. Except, of course, now you have Honor, kicking that that cart over as well. So, it's tell her that it's what she's comfortable in. Okay, Sharon has her court dress now, and she also has her sort of Grayson gown kind of thing. I cheat. I only go in uniform if I'm going to cosplay. What the heck? It works. Of course, that means that the Prime Minister of Manticore is constantly appearing in military uniform, which leads to all sorts of things about facade democracy comments and that kind of thing. I just thought I'd throw that out. Look, it's the general president for life. But there's some. The TRMN has some. Do we have civilian patterns available, or is it all just uniforms still? Is Diane still
Right
there?
now it's just uniforms.
Okay.
But there are a whole lot of stuff in the works.
Okay.
Especially for the peers. As you know, they're working really hard on the court dress and stuff
Yeah.
and the uniform development board is still coming up with new stuff, and they got to bring it to you and make sure it's okay. So yeah, there's new stuff coming out soon.
All right, well, let me know, because
Okay.
I'm tired of Lou bugging me about it.
Okay, well, just point out to her that this is an organization made up of individuals,
Yeah.
very much made up of
I got that right.
individuals.
I did, David, to go back to your saying earlier, I think two things. One, people don't know enough history, so they think that what you call the hyper partisanship today is sort of never happened before, and it's like, you should have been around when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were running against each other. If you want to see real vitriol. So yeah, it's very sharp, no doubt about it.
I think that one of the factors is that with social media and the 24/7 news
That doesn't help
cycle,
anything.
the whole nine
Yeah.
yards, the pressure cooker affects more of society than it used to.
Yeah, no, that's true. And despite the fact you're getting 24/7, the actual amount of news that you're getting is, and what I mean by that is literally the word new,
Yes.
is, and not surprisingly, I'm more likely to watch MSNBC than any other news channel. But what's striking to me, and I doubt very much if Fox is any different or CNN, is how much of it's just repetitive.
Yeah.
It's just the same thing over and over and over again.
Well, electronically, I tend to focus on one or two venues, but in print, electronic print. Wall Street Journal, The Guardian. I try to get across the spectrum
Yeah.
on that perspective, and I think print journalism even today, is less saturated than the purely
Oh yeah, no, there's
electronic.
no question about it. Sure,
Yeah.
sure. New York Times can't come out with a new edition every hour.
Yeah.
Neither can the Washington Post. I make it a point to read The Economist as often as I can. I had a subscription for a while, and then I just let it lapse.
Yeah.
But practically every article in The Economist is going to be an editorial, basically.
Well, okay, that's part of the problem.
But I don't know. I don't mind that because I mean they've had a consistent viewpoint for 150 years. I know what it
you're
is.
talking about The
There's
Economist.
No bones about it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so,
Well,
and they're so they're not being dishonest. And the news is quite comprehensive. It's
Yeah.
going to be looked at the way they look at things, but that's fine. I don't mind that.
Well,
What
every
does irritate me is when stuff gets slanted.
every news source is a lens and a prism. But I'm old enough, and so are you, Eric, to remember when John Chancellor first started appearing sitting off to one side on the soundstage under a sign that said commentary. And
Yeah.
that was the point at which analysis and commentary was inserted into the news. Walter Cronkite was a whole lot further left than most people would ever have guessed from watching one of his newscasts, if you were looking at it from the perspective of someone today. And I have to admit, I miss that.
There's times I do too, although there's also such a thing as a centrist bias, which is that, I don't know how to put it, this can sometimes irritate me, is when people tell you I am a moderate. And it's like, what the hell does that mean?
Yeah.
I am a moderate because some extremists think that 2 + 2 = 4, and other extremists think 2 + 2 = 2. But because I'm a moderate, I know
I think it equals 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no such thing as a moderate. I am not a moderate. What I am is quite far to the left. But then I understand the virtue of moderation. So, by the way, did Vladimir Lenin. And what happens is, as Lenin said many, many times, theory is gray, life is green, and the reality is going to be a lot more complicated than any theory can account for. So you have to realize that and say, oh, we didn't expect this.
Well,
then
I think
about it instead of saying, well, therefore it doesn't exist, or we're going to fit it into it.
I think the way that I would put it is that what you forget when you get into partisan debates is the art of compromise. And compromise does not mean compromising your principles.
No.
It means compromising to achieve a solution that everybody in the room can live with, whether they are delighted with it or not. And human beings being human beings, that's the best you can really hope to accomplish. Now, ideally, you'll keep the flow moving in the direction of greater human potential, greater human liberty, greater human, the whole 9 yards. But there are competing interests. There are perfectly valid competing viewpoints, and we have to have a stable society. The two ways you can do it. One is you can suppress the hell out of everybody you don't agree with.
Mhm.
The other one is you can listen to the people you don't agree with and come up with a solution that you can both tolerate.
Yeah.
And I tell people that most conservatives, which, as Eric has pointed out, and most liberals, most leftists, we want a lot of the same end game results. We disagree on how you get there.
Mhm.
And the most arrogant thing you could possibly do is to assume that you must be right and they must be wrong. And it's when people forget that, when all they can do is smite the Philistine hip and thigh, that you get into the kind of situation we're having today. And that's when when I'm posting on Facebook or wherever else, that's the position I try to take.
The other thing is that everybody, regardless, all political philosophies have what I'll call fault lines. They have areas where there are weak fissures that you got to be careful about. And for my own, and I'm a Marxist, I have been my whole adult life. It's the path to hell is paved with good intentions. It's which is what happened in the Russian Revolution. They were caught completely blindsided. They never occurred to them that a social revolution could go rotten the way that one did very quickly. And so they weren't prepared for it. That's the fault line that people on my side of the spectrum have to be cautious about, is that, it is where the term extremism does actually.
Well,
You
and
have to be moderate. You have to be not a moderate, but you have to understand that you need to moderate everything and realize that reality is going to be a lot more complex.
I think
And on the other side, with conservatives, the problem is that it's easy to slide into whatever is right. And because it exists, therefore it's right. No, not necessarily.
I think because it is, you have to approach enormous change to it cautiously. I think that one of the fault lines on the conservative side is that the recognition that the complete agency of the individual as opposed to the agency of the collective means that you are creating a system which is inherently liable to abuse by those who have acquired power in it. I think that's one of the big weaknesses of capitalism as currently practiced, is that you reach a point where somebody has acquired so much capitalist power that they're essentially invulnerable and they can do whatever the hell they want. And that is where you find the abuse of those who are weaker than you. And I think that one of the functions of a society has to be to protect those who do not have power from those who do. And that, I think, is one of the places where capitalism can fail. And so, like Eric is talking about fault lines on the left, there are fault lines on the right. There are weaknesses on the right. And anyone who is going to be a moral and ethical person, it's like, the difference between the moral man and the ethical man. The moral man knows what's right. The ethical man does what's right. Okay, well, you have to be both moral and ethical, or you cannot claim the mantle of being correct, as far as I'm concerned. And part of being moral and ethical is recognizing that, to paraphrase Oliver Cromwell, although not in the way in which he meant it, okay, to consider whether or not you may be wrong.
Yeah.
Consider in the bowels of Christ,
Yeah.
He did not think he was wrong.
No. It was the charge. It's a great turn of phrase. You got it.
Yes. Oh yeah. It's kind of yes. I think I'll take that and use it to mean something totally different because it's so good. Authors are magpies. What can I say?
He's. I've caught some hell for using Cromwell the way I have in the 1630s.
I wonder why.
Yeah, I know. There's people that just, and my standard response is, and it's also my standard response when people get pissed at me for the way I treat Jackson in the Sam Houston books, is, why aren't you denouncing me for George Washington? There's nothing they did that Washington didn't do.
Well, they're getting around to that now, Eric.
Well,
so,
yeah, I know. Well, yeah, no, but they're not even getting around for that reason.
I know.
And never mind. That debate drives me nuts. I remember when they pulled down the statue of Ulysses S. Grant. I remember thinking, boy, this is called unclear on the concept.
Okay. What about when they vandalized the monument to the 54th Massachusetts?
Yeah, but David, seriously, I gotta wonder who actually did that.
I don't know who did that. Okay?
No, but there is no question that there have been, some of this has been done by provocateurs. There's a reason that police provocation has been a tactic going at least as far back as the Krona. It's quite effective as a tactic because people will typically not think, well, wait a minute, does this make sense? They just automatically blame the one that looks like they did it.
Yeah.
So the one with the 54th Massachusetts, the only conceivable logic is they're pissed that not Robert Gould, what's his name?
The
It was a
commander.
Robert Shaw Gold. What was his name?
Yeah.
Yeah, that he's on the horse and the black guys are walking, at the foot of him. Well, that's what it would have looked like.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You know, it would look like that whether he was a white officer, a black officer, or a purple officer.
The standard thing I use with Andrew Jackson when people give me a hard time and start going on and on about how he was the worst raving racist in American history, apparently, is I say, you know what happened the first day he arrived in New Orleans on the eve of the Battle of New Orleans? And of course they don't. And I said, the very first day he arrived in December of 1814, he was confronted with a political crisis because New Orleans had by far the largest and most prosperous community of black freedmen in the country. And they wanted to organize two armed battalions of black soldiers to fight for the Union against the British. And every white plantation owner in the area was completely adamantly opposed to that. And these were not slaves, they were freedmen.
Yeah.
Didn't matter, they were black, that's what mattered. They did not want to see thousands of armed black men around. And Jackson immediately took the side of the freedmen and not only denounced the plantation owners a pack of traitors, and not only defended their right to be armed, but insisted that they be paid the same as white soldiers.
Yeah.
In other words, the
Louisiana,
very
free
first
gentlemen of
day
color.
Jackson arrived in New Orleans, he took a position it took Abraham Lincoln 2 years to get to in the Civil War. So I'll ask him, how do you explain that? And they just stare at me. And I said, history, people are more complicated. I finally warmed up to Jackson. I researched him a lot, and I started off basically hostile to him.
Yeah.
Warmed up as time went on.
I had that experience with Sherman.
Yeah.
Sherman was an incredibly complex guy when you got in there. And the reason that I love history is because you can't make this shit up.
No.
Okay, it's the greatest novel ever written. Okay, it's all full of twists and turns, and how did he wind up there? How did she wind up going there? And I don't know that I am a believer in the great leader theory of history, the great man, the great woman. But I will tell you the truth. You can't study history without finding great men and great women who are absolutely pivotal.
Oh, no, that's absolutely
to the way
true.
that history turned out.
That's absolutely true. Now, you and I have talked about, Lenin's premature death at the age of
oh, God, that was
54 was just an absolute disaster for the whole world. It wasn't just Russia.
Yeah.
You would have still gotten a degeneration of the Russian Revolution. There was no way that wasn't going to happen given the isolation and poverty of Russia, but you wouldn't have gotten the monstrosity that Stalin turned it into.
No, because they were such different people.
They were different people.
And I'll tell you the truth, Lenin could have held it together without resorting to what Stalin resorted to.
He wouldn't have had to. He wouldn't have had
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. But and that's one of the reasons that Eric and I write novels, is not to be Lenin holding it together, but to look at things like that, where human beings make a difference, and even non-humans in science fiction. But both of us do, okay? And neither one of us writes dystopian fiction.
No.
And that is because I think both of us are fundamentally optimistic about human beings, and because we do believe in human agency. We believe in, Eric and I, our characters may have different political philosophies, but one thing that they share is they are the responsible human being. They're adults.
There's another side to it, which it's been a few years now, but a friend of mine, and still one, and a former comrade, that is the term that socialists use in the movement, criticized me because he said, I don't see very much, socialist politics in your writings, your fiction. And I said, you don't, because it's not there. And I said, I do not put my political views in my fiction, and I don't do it for a couple of reasons. One of them, I think it's fundamentally dishonest. People don't buy a book in order for me to lecture them about politics. They buy a book that I told them would entertain them. And I said, you know, if I were to put together all the things I wrote in my years of political activist, it would probably fill 6 or 7 pretty thick volumes. There's nothing stops me from publishing it, but if I try to make a living off of it,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, and there's this too, Eric. It's less the structure in which the characters are operating than it is why the characters are operating. And you've got Hans Richter, you've got a bunch of folks who are incredible spokesmen for the values that inform your politics, if not necessarily for the structure and the specific ideology that informs your politics.
Here's the way I put it, David, is that all politics, I don't care if you're Marxist, to the right of Attila the Hun, it doesn't matter. All politics, all political philosophy, all political, you know, exposition depends upon abstracting the individual out of the equation, because you have to, or else you're talking about 7 billion people. How the hell are you going to make sense out of that?
Yes.
Every one of whom is a complete separate individual. So you subtract the individual out, and then you talk about people in terms of classes, races, you know, whatever it is you're trying to get across. And the problem is that storytelling depends entirely on the individual.
Yeah.
And you have to, I don't know if you ever read any socialist realism, but what makes it such god awful crap is that the individual is abstracted out of it. So it's basically, you know, Joe the worker got up in the morning and went to work for Jack the capitalist who exploited him. And it's like, oh God, you're already you know, dozing off.
Upton Sinclair, I could handle.
Yeah, and what's his name? The guy who wrote Quiet Flows of Dawn isn't bad. You know, yeah, there are some exceptions, but the point is that literature is just terrible at expressing political views. It really is. What it's great at, though, what it's really good at is expressing moral viewpoints. And ethical stances. And a lot of people can share that or don't necessarily agree the same way politically.
Well, and one thing that you can do that I think it's kind of incumbent upon you to do is that you can have people of differing political persuasions who you still reveal as either moral or conversely immoral human beings.
Yeah.
The fact that somebody, I mean, you know, it's like Michael Oversteegen, okay, is one of my favorite characters out of the Honorverse. And he's like, you know, Eric especially has had fun with Michael.
Oh, yeah.
You know, because he's like, yeah, I belong to a privileged system, and that's the way it should be. But along with the privileges come responsibilities.
Yeah.
Okay, and he's also totally willing to engage with people who don't share his views. And I think that is one of the things that you can do is you can remind the reader, if you're going to be, you know, doing deep moral stuff instead of just trying to write a thumping good adventure story or whatever, you can remind people that people are people. And I think one of the marks of bad fiction, and not necessarily just socialist realism, but of bad fiction.
Oh no,
generally,
there's plenty of other bad fiction.
Is, you know, you pin the identifying label on the character, and then that's what that character is, not who that character is.
That's why I will not read. I will read writers on the right as long as they're not doing something that just offends me, not because of the politics, but just because it's so goddamn stupid.
Yep.
You know, I mean, and there are writers on the left who do the same thing, but that's where I just, oh, come on. I enjoyed Tom Clancy at the beginning, and then when I finally bailed on him was, I think it was Rainbow Six, where his villain was a genius biologist who was also a genius capitalist and was also a crazed environmentalist who wanted to destroy the entire human race. And it's like, no, two of those okay.
Maybe
but
two
not
of the
all
above.
three.
Well, I think
I'll accept the brilliant genius who wants to kill the whole human race. That's pretty much the Unabomber. And I'll accept a brilliant capitalist who's also, a brilliant, there's plenty of those, but not all three. It's just ridiculous.
I think by the time Rainbow Six came out, Clancy himself was pretty much out of the picture.
I don't know. That could be. That could
be. Well, I can't read the current created by Clancy novels. And I have the same problem with Clive Cussler. I had some of that problem with Cussler while he was still producing his own work, but now you're looking at all these spin-off series and whatnot. One of the problems with a really long series, a really big world like the Honorverse, for example, is that if the person who originated that universe shuffles off, okay, readers, they treasure the universe that existed.
Mm-hmm.
And the established readers are not going to be happy if somebody comes in and starts making significant changes to it. You may build a new readership who finds it through the older books and whatnot. But as an example, Phil Pornell and I are going to be continuing the Tran books.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we have agreed to going in is we're not going to try to be Jerry. Okay, we can't.
Mm-hmm.
We could produce.
Which books are these?
The Janissary novels.
Oh yeah.
Okay, well, Mamelukes just came out. Okay,
right.
And Phil and I are planning on continuing the series. Ultimately, it may shift to Phil alone, but for at least the next 3 books, it'll be both of us. And we both understand that we cannot reproduce Jerry's voice.
No. Because
it's not natural to either of us. So we are going to operate under the assumption or on the plan that the established characters are going to remain basically who they are, speaking with the voices that Jerry had already given them. And that we will be focusing on the new characters who are going to be introduced as our growth and change perspective. And that we're just going to have to write in our own voices moving forward. I think that will work. Okay. What I don't think would work would be us trying to simply reproduce Jerry's way of telling the story. That's another reason why I'm looking at collaborators right now. I think that a series hands off to a new writer best when the new writer has been part of the series for several books before all of a sudden they find themselves having to go it alone.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. The one exception I make to reading Amazon reviews of my books is I do read them for the sequels that I wrote with Dave Freer on, and in one case, Misty Lackey, to the James Schmitz's Witches of Carries. And I have been pleased that all 3 books we've done get 4 better stars, and they keep that from a lot of reviewers over a long period of time. And people are satisfied that we've kept James Schmitz's voice and we've done it. But it was, it's tricky. And on the other hand, when I had to finish the story arc that was begun by David Drake and Steve Sterling with The Reformer, because Steve Sterling and Jim Bain had a falling out, and Steve left, and the story had to be finished. And so Jim asked me to do it. And Steve is a friend of mine and has been for many years now. And he's a very good writer, but he and I just don't look at the world the same way.
Yeah.
I
can see that.
Yeah. And I looked at the way he developed the story, and I said, screw it. And I picked a different character who was a secondary character in his book, and he became the central character in my book, because I could approach the story from a 90-degree angle, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it worked. It worked fine. But yeah, I think you're making the right decision. It could possibly work continuing the same voice, but it's got to be. In the case of Witches of Carries, both Dave Freer and I were comfortable with the original voice. I mean, and actually Dave did the first draft of all of them, and he prepared for it. I wouldn't have done it by literally typing out the first 50 pages of Witches of Carries, just to feel that he'd gotten it into his fingers, I guess. But it's tricky. It really is.
That's an interesting approach that would not have occurred to me.
No,
but,
no, I wouldn't have done it either. Dave can be a bit of a
Well,
maniac.
that's kind of interesting because the Sword of the South, the which, by the way, the sequel to that is supposed to be my next solo Bane project. But anyway, I originally wrote that novel a year before Steve and I sold our first book to Bane, and it was rejected by someone who said it didn't have a credible villain. I couldn't quite figure that out. Steve's theory was that it was because she didn't have sex with the dragon. She wasn't a credible villain. I was like, I don't think that's it, Steve. But anyway, I'm not sure what it was, but I don't think that was it. But the manuscript and the two big floppies that it was stored on disappeared, got lost, and didn't turn up. And then one of the floppies turned up. And we're talking a 22-year-old 78 record-sized floppy, okay, that was in CPM using WordStar, okay. It turned up somewhere it shouldn't have been. And I said, oh, that's an interesting artifact of the sheet metal age, you know. And then about 6 months later, the second disc turned up in a totally different, totally inappropriate location. So I took them over to one of the IT outfits here in town, and I said, what do you think? And they said, well, let's spend $800 to buy a machine to read them, and we can't guarantee what we'd get, but we can try. So I said, okay, fine, do it. And they recovered every single word of the original manuscript, but it was totally not editable because every line ended in a hard carriage return in the resurrected form. So since 24 years had passed since I wrote it anyway, I put the entire thing through Dragon. And also because of the other books that I'd said in that universe, there'd been changes. I put the entire book through Dragon. And it was an interesting experience because I was kind of doing to myself what you're talking about here with typing the first 50 pages or whatever out. And I remember one of my readers said, well, this is like, you know, it's like 20 years out of date from where fantasy is now. And I was like, oh, really? You know, so I was cutting edge 20 years ago. But it's sometimes you do, if you've been away from a universe for a while, sometimes you have a problem recapturing the voice of that universe.
Oh, sure.
I mean, the Hell's Gate books are probably the most complex thing that I've ever written.
Yeah, remind me, which of those, David?
The Hell's Gate, Hell Hath No Fury, The Road to Hell. They're the ones. It's intersecting alternate universes.
Oh yeah, I know.
Magic.
Those I have not read. Okay.
Well, shame on you.
I know.
But there's stuff that is buried in the weeds in there that hopefully someday we'll get around to telling the reader, like the fact that the Chironians are using Newtonian physics, and that's what works in their universe, which is kind of key to figuring out how the whole thing happened. But I have 3 separate universes, because there are the 2 that the books are about, and then there's ours, that have different names for the same geographical features. Okay? And so just keeping track of that for the reader is incredibly complex by the time you get into it. I have these 3 glossaries that have the place names for everything that we've talked about cross-filed so that we can find it. And Joelle and I are looking at starting on the 4th book in the series. And someday we would really like to do the one where our universe gets involved. And for those who think that Stone Mountain is racist, I'm sure they will be horrified to discover that the portal that has been planned all along to open in the middle of Stone Mountain and sort of devour most of that sculpture, which had nothing to do with, because that was planned like, gosh, 15 years ago. You know? But it's tough sometimes going back and revisiting someplace you haven't been in a while, as the writer.
Well, you know, I had actually written with 3 friends of mine a novel before what became Philosophical Strangler and Forward to Mage. There was actually a novel that came before that was the basis for those being developed, and we finished it. And this was back in 1969, 1970. This is before Xerox. The only way you could get something, unless you made a carbon copy of something, the only way you could get a copy of it, we could have gone to UCLA's photography department and they would have photographed it, but it would have cost God only knows how much. So we lent it to a friend of ours. And
had they even come up with Thermofax yet?
I don't think so. There was no way to make a copy of it that was not going to cost us money. And we gave it to a friend of ours, and she lost it. And I have lived in dread for half a century now.
That it'll turn up.
That it'll turn up, and someone will start blackmailing me that if you don't pay me, I'm publishing it.
Well,
it was puerile. I can't even call the humor sophomoric because we didn't have that excuse. We weren't even sophomores anymore. It was just, pretty gross, a lot of it.
Oh, the first novel that I ever wrote, I wrote in the 8th grade. And thank God, that it was typed and only 1 copy, no carbon, and paper burns. That's all I can say.
The first novel I ever wrote, I was 14, and it was my girlfriend, the one who just died, rewrote it in her handwriting so it'd be legible. Talk about no greater devotion. I mean, that vanished a long time ago, thankfully. It was a novel that had no characters in it and no dialogue. It was just, a 14-year-old's World War III story.
Yeah. That's actually is what we wrote.
Yeah.
Did I ever tell you about Tony and my filing cabinet?
Tony and your which?
My filing cabinet.
No.
I have a filing cabinet here behind me, and it has one deep drawer that contains short stories that were never written for publication, that were never intended for publication. And I think of them as my etudes. They're where I wanted to work on a specific thing. How is this going to work in creating a character and presenting dialogue? How do I resolve this problem? And I was talking about them at a convention. I mentioned that I had done them as part of learning my craft, and I said, thank God they'll never see the light of day. And Tony said, "Oh, you think not?" And I said, "No." And she said, "David, you won't live forever." And I was
right.
like, "No, but I have a can of gasoline in a match."
Better use it. You better use it, David. As popular as you are, somebody will do it.
Well, I just,
it's what the hell? It's the nature of the trade we're in.
yeah.
It's
Okay. To succeed at what we do, we have to produce something that speaks to our readers. And the point that I try to make a lot is novels, even a solo novel, is a collaboration, because it's a collaboration between the writer and the reader.
oh yeah.
Okay. Honor Harrington is a different person to every single person who has ever read one of my novels, because you build Honor Harrington in your own mind on the basis of what I tell you about who she is and what she does. There are nuances in her motivation. So I can tell you exactly why she did something, and there will still be a nuance in there because it's going to be the way that you understand what I told you about what she did. And so if you find something of good in one of my characters, it's because something of the good in my character is speaking to something of the good in your character.
The way I put it is I tell people that 90% of what's in a novel is put in it by the reader. What we're doing is it's not a photograph. It's kind of like a impressionist, pointillist painting, and the reader with their own mind is what fills in all the details and gives it the color that whatever it is. And you're right, every reader's going to read a different book.
Eric and I are still around the campfire telling you the story. Okay, we are not in an electronic medium where you can say, okay, this is what the character looks like. Okay. And I think there's a greater degree of intimacy involved in all of this. Okay, by the way, I'm looking at the chat here, and I am seeing that people are saying, is it okay to ask questions? And I think, Eric, that what they are saying is they would like
Oh, there's
to ask a
99.
question.
Oh my God, I hadn't even looked at it. All right, we should probably click on them.
It's fine. So Patrick Geezy has a question.
Yes,
Yeah.
Patrick.
Gentlemen, so first of all, it's wonderful to hear you two going back and forth like this.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of implication in the relationship that you guys have around your writing, right? So one of the things is that I hear talk a lot about utilizing, either formally or informally, the concept of archetypes for expressing character of people, characters that you're building. Some writers like to use certain archetypes for developing characters or for presenting a character within the context of the story arc to allow the reader to latch on to that archetype, because there are certain assumptions, and of course it shifts from culture to culture. So there are, archetypes in the US culture are different than archetypes in a lot of the European cultures or the
Asian cultures.
Yeah. So there's that aspect of it, and I think depending on the writer, isn't it that you have to decide how much of an archetype do I offer in order to engage the reader? Would that be a fair statement? Or is, assuming that you're actually using the concept of archetype, right? Consciously.
Go Eric.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't doubt that I do that quite a bit, but I'm not conscious of it. It's not something I'm doing consciously. I'm not thinking, well, what's the archetype I'm going to use? But when you tell a story, not just tell a story, when you talk with anybody about anything, I don't know how to put it, your whole culture, your whole history, everything around you is coming into that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that shapes it is I don't know if archetype exactly is the word I'd use, just because to me, the word has the implication of sort of firm, clear borders around it, which I don't think real people necessarily have. But
I think every writer writes within the context of his or her culture. And there are what I think of as cultural shorthand notations that we use, because we know we're speaking to someone who shares our culture. So if we say X, it's going to connect to Y for them. I don't really think of myself as using archetypes, except that I like to create what the reader thinks is an archetype and then go somewhere else with them.
He's Mickey Dog.
Yeah, I know. Just yeah. What can I say? Yeah, it's okay. Not so much in terms of a character, but in terms of archetypal world building. I went to great lengths to convince everyone that the People's Republic of Haven was France, because it wasn't.
Yeah.
And that's an example of using an archetype in order to accomplish something completely different from giving you connectivity that you wouldn't have had otherwise. I wanted you to connect to the tennis court oath and Rob S. Pierre and all the rest of it, so that when you found out that that wasn't what it was at all,
Right.
it would. And another thing, a lot of people thought when I created the People's Republic of Haven that what I was saying is, any state that tries to take care of the material needs of its citizens is inevitably going to turn into a dictatorship and be busted. Okay. And in fact, if you go back and look, what I'm saying is the entire People's Republic of Haven came into existence as the result of a corrupt deal by people who were already power holders in the society. And so what happened is it wasn't created by an attempt to provide for its citizens. It was created by people gaming the system for their own ends. Now, I do think that if I'm making a statement at all, ultimately in terms of, I am saying that the best a society can do is to provide equality of opportunity, that no society can provide equality of outcomes. Can't guarantee it. I would stand by that as a general principle. But in terms of, a lot of people are like, oh man, he must think all socialists should be stood up against the wall and shot. I mean, no, only the ones like Eric, It's
Well, I can't tell you how many times I've got in arguments with people who are going to lecture me about
The evils of
Hunter Harrington
socialism.
universe,
yeah.
about which I have helped write several novels, and they'll sit there and explain to me that in the People's Republic of Haven that David has shown the fallacies of socialism. And I say, first of all, it's not a socialist society. Let's start with that.
Yeah.
And David knows that, and I know he knows it because he told me, because he's literate and he understands never mind. What it is a kind of, David and I, by the way, have spent hours very friendly arguing about this, because I don't think People's Republic of Haven is really plausible, because what it really is a crazed social democratic welfare state that's gone on a militaristic binge, and it's never happened, goddammit. And on the other hand, his counter argument is it could.
It hasn't happened yet.
The problem is I can't prove him wrong, because I can understand the logic of what he created. I just think it's in the nature of things that a welfare state's going to be soft and saggy and just I mean,
squishy.
Anybody really imagined Denmark going on a crusade to conquer the world? I mean, it's just the Norwegians. I mean, yeah, back my ancestors.
Now, wait a minute. You don't want to bring the Norwegians into this guy.
Yeah, I know. Well, okay.
Not a good idea, dude.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
I'm sorry. We're veering off from your question.
So no, and that's there again, excellent discussion. I like where it spun off to, but the flip side of that then was, and this is probably more directed towards David rather than Eric, because Eric, you're not as involved with, exploring the technologies, right?
Mm-mm.
At what point do you break away from? So I'm a technology futurist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm looking out far beyond what we currently understand things to be, because we have certain models, or if you will, archetypes in place, the way we understand digital technology, for example,
Yeah.
and things like that, right? At what point do you kind of not pull back the cover and say, this is what the future is really going to look like, because there is nothing in fact there 1,000 years into the future that we could possibly relate to, because things have shifted so radically.
You mean the technology or the people?
Technology in particular.
Well,
People,
okay.
human nature is remarkably consistent.
Yeah.
So.
Well, okay, I think you're absolutely correct about that. But on the other hand, human nature that has had advanced technology is a fairly new phenomenon. We don't know what it's going to be like after another 6 generations of taking tech for granted. Okay.
Right.
I think that in my case, I operate on the assumption that human nature is going to be human nature. The tools with which they approach their problems may change. And in terms of where I'm going with the technology that I allow myself, the closer I am to where we are right now, the less unobtainium or balonium I'm willing to allow myself. In the Honorverse, if you look at it, my equivalent of the transporter in the Honorverse is the way that I visualize hyperspace working and the ability to generate gravity. But if you take those two things away, I'm not postulating anything hugely, no new general theory of everything that's going to move us into manipulating things with force fields and the rest of it. Now, the one thing that I sort of regret about the way that I set the Honorverse up, and bear in mind that I wrote the first novel in the year the Berlin Wall fell. Yes, that long ago, before history ended. The internet didn't exist yet when I wrote the first book, and I had just come off of writing both the Honorverse and not the Honorverse, Mutineer's Moon, and Path of the Fury. Okay. And in both of those, I had neural interfacing and everything else. And so I deliberately went with keyboards in the Honorverse. And there are other elements that if I were starting the series today, it would start with very different beginning assumptions in certain areas. The thing I'm a little surprised about is the extent to which it has stood the test of time, hung together. And it's been possible for me to integrate some of the changing concepts and whatnot into it without making huge problems for in-universe continuity. Go, Eric.
I was just going to say there are some exceptions, one of which I'm still bitter about, which is that in the first chapter of the new book we're working on, I have this marvelous scene where Catherine Montaigne is sailing across Mesa looking at the wreckage below her in her yacht, and she orders the AI who runs the ship to take away the floor beneath her so she can see below her. And him and Tom Pope immediately sent me an email. No, you can't do that. That technology doesn't exist where she could tell the AI to do that. And I said, for Christ's sake, we have it right now. I can tell Alexa, she's right over there, and he said, yeah, I know, but we don't have it in the uninherited universe because I didn't think of it. So,
well, actually you do. The problem is that you can't, the AI doesn't interact with you the way that you had the AI interacting with you.
All right. The
Honorverse's basic assumption is that self-aware AI is not possible. People say, well, where's the AI in the universe? I say,
that's
the Honorverse is lousy with AI.
She's not self-aware. She's a freaking goddamn computer, and they're dumber than a rock.
And we'll work with it.
I got it. My favorite David obsessive technology story, though, is when I wrote Fanatic. And I had the scene where the captain goes crazy on the SD, and the heroes are sitting in a room in the ship, and a midship or a rating races in panicky because the captain's gone mad, And she tells him they started a ship, and one of the officers leans over, puts his fingers on the wall,
And feels the beat
and
of the
feels the
reciprocating
vibration. Oh my
engine.
God, she started the engines. And so I sent that to David. I get an email back from him saying, no, that won't work, Eric. Those engines don't have any vibration. And I'm almost fired back an email saying, David, you invented all of this.
That's how I know it
You
had
can
to
do
have any
whatever you
vibration.
want them to do.
Yeah.
So
So anyway, what he did was, this is partly why it worked out okay, is because he's quite good at this, is he said, but there would be auxiliary engines of one kind or another. Those could create the vibration
Vibrations.
that you
Yeah.
got.
That's like the slam, that's like
Working in this world.
the slamming things in Galaxy Quest, right?
Yeah.
And the statement, who the hell puts these things on board a ship?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, gentlemen, thank you very much. Appreciate you answering my questions.
You're welcome.
So Kay has a question.
Okay.
Okay, there she goes.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm interested that both of you are historians, amateur historians. Eric, you seem to be a Charles Beard and Marxist, maybe a New Left historian, while David is a Bornstein, Hofstadter, maybe consensus or postmodern historian. What kind of historian do you consider yourselves to be?
Well, my model for history is actually probably Karl Marx or Frederick Engels. I mean, but what's always interesting is people think they know what Marx thought and said. David Drake once said to me, we were chatting, he says, yeah, but Eric, you're not a doctrinaire Marxist. And I said, no, to the contrary, David, I am. It's just that I know what the doctrine is. And it starts with the fact that it's not a doctrine in the first place. I mean, Marx would have been appalled at the idea. You know, Marx didn't like the term Marxism. Lenin didn't like the term Leninism. Trotsky detested the word Trotskyism because it's not an ism. But if you read Marx's his own historical writings, and he wrote histories, or probably the single greatest history ever written by a Marxist was Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. You will discover that it's not Charles Beard, and it's hard to explain it, but it's what drives me nuts when I hear people tell me what they think I think is, it's like, do you really think my brain clanks that much? I mean, I'm not addressing this at you, but what I'm saying is that I can probably put it better this way. A very good friend of mine named Bruce Levine, who's I was an activist with, he and I were very close for years in the socialist movement. He later left the movement and became a professional historian. In his case, he just retired recently. And he wrote a book once called Half Slave, Half Free, which is a social history of the coming of the Civil War. It doesn't look so much at political things, but talks about the social attitudes that developed. And I asked him how it was received, and he was amused. He says, well, I get a lot of criticism from the American Historical Association. Probably 2/3 of them think they're Marxist. And he says, I get a lot of criticism from him because it's not Marxist enough. And it was just hysterical because it, in fact, is impeccably. It's just he doesn't use any of the jargon. And that's because he doesn't need to. You know, the jargon's handy, but you don't need it. And I don't know, to me, the heart of it is what Marx called the materialist interpretation of history, which is just simply that what defines the human race to begin with is the fact that we are the species that survives by working, and no other species does. And that's because you have to be intelligent to do that. So we manipulate our environment, and everything else flows from that. It's that, therefore, we create societies that are social, because they have to be, because you can't work on your own. And and anyway, I'm going to stop there. But and I don't really, if I were to have to pin how David thinks is an historian might actually been not too different from Churchill, leaving aside the imperialism. Let's not forget Churchill was a flaming imperialist, in addition to the qualities he's prized for. There were parts of him you don't really want to look at too closely.
Hey,
Well, what
you-
can I say?
that's why you wear clothes.
So Matthew Foster has a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is, what authors do you guys read to like inspire you, or like what authors inspired you to become authors?
Oh my God. I doubt that Eric or I read as much as we would like to read today.
No, not anymore. No.
Yeah.
Well, that's not the way I'd put it, David. I still read a huge amount, but I don't read very much anymore just for the fun of reading something.
Well, I think the way I look at it, I've used this, some of you have probably been at panels and heard me use this before. I think anybody has X amount of what I think of as literary energy. And you can use the same amount reading 75,000 words by somebody else or writing 5,000 of your own. And that's the trade-off. And it is unfortunately true that the more you write, the less time you have to read. In terms of who helped form me as a writer, every single person I ever read helped form me as a writer one way or another. We are, as writers, the sum of everything we've ever read, plus whatever it is that we individually bring to the process. When I was younger, the very first science fiction novel I ever read, I was 10 years old when I read Jack Williamson's Legion of Space. That was the first science fiction novel I ever read. And the next one, which I read like immediately after it, was Sprague de Camp and Schuler Mitchell's Genus Homo, both of which are still, Legion of Space is a lot more dated in terms of its concepts and whatnot, but they're both, huge impressions on it. But at the same time, at that point, I was discovering Arthur Ransom. I was discovering The Black Stallion, Walter Farley. I was reading You Were There at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. I was just on the cusp of my first Robert Heinlein. So all of that is, Eric mentioned Murray Leinster earlier. A lot of people today have never read Murray Leinster, which is sad because there's a lot of stuff in there. Clifford Simak is somebody else who's sort of fallen by the wayside. But those were all, now in terms of the ones who I think my writing resonates with the most, I would list H. Beam Piper, probably Randall Garrett in some ways for the humor and my love of hiding puns and Easter eggs in there. Heinlein, Asimov, not as much.
No, maybe.
But those are the folks who spring to. Oh, and obviously, Roger, because he started publishing, when I was like 12. All right. But all of those are in the mix. Eric?
Well, people have asked me, what are the single most biggest literary influence on me as a writer is actually the Japanese movie director Akira Kurosawa.
I can see that.
I tend to write Kurosawa type stories, I guess you'd say. Although, having said that, he did a lot of films that people aren't aware of. Everybody knows Seven Samurai and Rashomon, but he's also the guy who did Ikiru, about a dying bureaucrat who builds a playground for children. The second would actually be Westerns, especially Luke Short and Louis L'Amour. Probably.
Louis L'Amour, yes.
Well, 1632 is a Western.
Yeah.
With the serial numbers filed off. But the basic plot of that novel is that into the valley where ruthless powerful ranchers,
Cattle barons.
cattle barons are running roughshod over the honest homesteaders, rides the fastest gun in the West, but nobody knows he's the fastest gun in the West because he's sworn he's going to hang up his guns. And then he falls in love with a fine girl from the East. Trust me, I grew up on this stuff. And but as far as science fiction goes, it was Heinlein. With me, it was Heinlein, Norton, and Clark.
Oh, I forgot
those
Norton.
three.
I forgot Norton.
I
Yeah.
always had trouble with H. Beam Piper, and probably because the first thing of his I read was Space Viking, which I found appalling. Well, I did. I mean,
Well, Space Vikings is one of those books you either love or you hate.
Yeah, I know. Well, it wasn't so much. It was the scene where he goes over and shoots a guy in the head because his wife has just died because the hero has caused her death, and he says he did him a favor. And it's like, oh man, I mean, talk about I don't know what's the word. Anyway, never mind. I've always had trouble with Piper. My favorite Piper novel, by the way, is 4-Day Plan.
Actually, I don't think that happened. I think what happened is somebody got shot, and he said, "I wish someone had done that for me after my wife died." Yeah, I mean, it's almost as bad, but it's not quite the same.
No, you're right. But it's like, yeah, you're right. But it's like he's saying this about somebody that he is responsible for being dead. My favorite of his books is 4-Day Planet, which I found. That one I really like.
Did you ever read Uller Uprising? The Sepoy Mutiny on Another Planet?
Yeah, no, I did. And I think I was appalled by that one too, if I remember.
I figured you would be.
The one that people often, bring up to me because it's got the closest similar to my own writing is Lord Calvin of Utterwin.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to criticize that one because I said, "Oh, give me a break." The first thing that happens is that he arrives and he's in a gunfight with this beautiful woman who just turns out to be the princess. How ridiculous is that? And then I use almost exactly the same mechanism at the beginning.
Comes home to haunt you.
Well,
that's why you want to be.
It works,
That's why to be careful about the criticisms you
I
can
know.
make to
You
print.
Beyond that, it's my taste in reading ranges a lot. I adored. I haven't read him in some years now, but I adored Fyodor Dostoevsky, even though his politics are appalling. I like William Faulkner a great deal. Never had much use for Hemingway.
Oh, geez.
Well, the problem I had with Hemingway was simple. It was like all the themes that seemed to obsess him are things I figured out the answer to when I was 17, I mean,
see, that's because you were a forward thinker and he wasn't. In terms of what I'm reading today, I'm reading the Leotin. Those are wonderful books. If you haven't read them,
by Liam Miller,
the Leotin novels.
Yeah.
And what else am I reading? I'm basically reading anything that I pick up that I have a free moment for, which is the way I always read. I just don't have as many free moments.
Yeah, that's pretty much the way it is with me.
Yeah, and I have to say, I have been more seduced into movies than I used to be. And I haven't quite figured out why that is, although I think the answer is probably that with most movies, you're making a 2-hour investment in the story rather than however long it's going to take you to read the book. And I'd rather make the longer investment, but I can't. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. But I try to be discerning in the movies I watch. I don't go to the theater all that much. I'm more inclined to download them from Amazon or something because they're quality pictures that may not be all that new that I just hadn't seen, kind of thing. Yeah. And I binge watched a couple of TV. Okay, now here's an interesting thought. This is sort of playing off of what do you read. I limit myself to maybe one television series at a time because of the time sink involved. And for example, I was a huge fan of Person of Interest. Okay. I've recently gone back and rewatched the entire Babylon 5 series. Well, up until the end of the War with the Shadows. After that, it starts getting a little weird. But I think that what drew me to Person of Interest and to Babylon 5 in a lot of ways is the complexity of the evolving characters. And the fact that, especially in Person of Interest, if you look at it, all of the characters, all of them are flawed. And it's the flaws that ultimately give them their strength. Does that make sense?
I've never watched it, so I can't tell you if I agree with you or not, but yeah, it makes sense. Sure.
Well, and it's grappling. It's one of the more intelligent efforts that I've seen to grapple with the implications of the possibility of self-aware superintelligence. Is it good? Is it evil? Is it both? Kind of thing. If you get the time, Eric, it definitely would be worth your watching. I avoided it initially because I thought it was going to be another enemy of the state thing with, like, the one that what Will Smith did, where, and I tuned in early for a baseball game and caught the last 20 minutes of an episode about halfway through the first season. And that was the point at which I realized, whoa, this is a whole bunch different than I thought it was, and went and tracked it down. The final season, for those of you who've seen Person of Interest, that final season where they got their feet back under them and did that whole race to the finish line, that was fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have another? I noticed some people are signing off, which makes.
Yep. I have a list of 3 more people that have questions at the moment.
Okay.
So Mike Dunford has a question.
So this kind of ties into what Patrick was asking about earlier, and when you were talking about the tech and the changes in particular. When you're setting up with, I guess, not to get too Mark Twain or anything, but how much of a universe is made and how much just kind of happens when you're putting together these long series like 1632 or the Honorverse?
For me, an awful lot of it gets laid out ahead of time. However, what I am normally laying out is a snapshot of where the tech is and so forth at the beginning of the series. One of the things that I think a lot of military science fiction gets wrong, for example, is a war that lasts 40 years is being fought with exactly the same technology at the end of it that it was at the beginning.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, well, you can take the position that, okay, the technology is mature, et cetera, but if you're going to do that, you have to write about a sort of Japan with the borders closed situation.
Yeah.
Something where there's a reason the status quo is not changing. Steve Jackson, the game designer, and I were at a con together, and he said, I want to thank you for the Honor Harrington books. And I said, you're welcome. And he said, no, the thing that I love about the Honor Harrington books and the Starfire books is the technology changes. And I said, well, yeah, because it does. And he said, yes, but it doesn't. So essentially, I go through and I actually have my little check boxes about, health sciences and transportation and communications and so forth that I lay out. I just had to do this again for Richard Fox and I are doing the collaboration. It's the launch of the Murphyverse, the prequel to the Honorverse. And I had to go through and set up the tech Bible from scratch for him and for me for that universe. One of the things about it is the technology in it is radically different from the technology of Elysia's time, and it's radically different from the technology in the Honorverse. And that means that when I get ready to write the battles and whatnot, it's a whole different kind of battle, which is kind of cool. But in this case, it's kind of like I know where the technology that I created just now is going to end up when it matures by Elysia's time, if that makes sense. But by and large, you know, I generally have strands that I project forward. Okay, so for example, in the Honorverse, I knew that I was going to move into FTL communications tactically. I knew that I was going to move into the light attack craft. I hadn't worked out exactly how all that was going to work, but I knew I was going to go there. But beyond that, it was a question of, you know, how do I make it happen when I get there? Have you read House of Steel?
Just getting there. I'm the guy who's been in the TRMN for like 5 days, so
okay. Well,
I'm almost through everything.
Okay, well, read I Will Build My House of Steel. That's the short novel in the front of House of Steel. King Roger was always, in my thinking, the make or break point for the Star Kingdom surviving. But it was all done before Honor ever came on the scene. And that's the point at which I finally get to tell you what Roger did and how it influenced and why the technology is going where it's going. And I'd wanted to write that as a novel for years and never found a good place to put it. So when we did House of Steel, it was like, you know, it's like Reese's where peanut butter meets chocolate. It was perfect.
Our next question is from Ryan Taylor.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
First off, thank you both for living and making many great books for us all to read. It's been wonderful. And questions I do have are mostly towards you, David Weber, and one's simple and one's a bit more complex. The simple one is you've mentioned the Mutineer's Moon.
Yeah.
Are you planning to write any more books in that series? Because I think there's left on sort of cliffhanger and, well, not really a cliffhanger, but there are still several things to do.
Yeah, well, they're definitely unresolved. They are at a resting point, which has sort of been why they've been resting all this time. It's kind of like, you know, it's a sleeping giant. Let it be. I'm actually planning at least 2 more books in that series ultimately. And I'm planning 2. Okay. That does not say a word about the only series that I am confident that I am going to stick to the number of projected books in is the Sword of the South series, because I have all 5 of them plotted out, and at the end of it, trust me, it's the end of the story. Yeah, by the way, I plan to leave the series on a cliffhanger anyway, because the last thing that's going to happen before they trash the Occupani master computer is it's going to send a message back to the other galaxy, to the Great Nest Killers, about where they went and hid. And so they're going to be like, yes, the war is over. We can, wait, where did that message go? So they're going to have to build up anyway. You know, what can I say?
Great.
Yeah. But yeah, that's where that is. Yes.
Oh, so that was my first question. The second question is, are you ever planning or thinking about introducing actual aliens in the Honorverse? And if so, why?
There are aliens. Yes, there are aliens in the Honorverse.
They appear in the very first
First
book,
book, yeah.
early, and then he doesn't do anything with them.
You're
And
talking, okay. There is only in the Honorverse one technologically advanced alien species, which you've never met yet, and which you may never meet because I may decide not to write about them. And they have high tech only because they got it from the humans. The basic concept for the Honorverse is that even with faster than light travel, the human sphere is a tiny bubble.
It's just a bitty bubble. Yeah.
It's a bitty bubble. And that the odds of there being two advanced spacefaring species in that same bubble at the same flicker in, in the eye of God kind of thing is remote. Okay. Now, trust me, I've written plenty of stuff that has aliens in it. And I'm, it's like when I did in Fury Born, okay, you've got two starfaring alien species at the same time that humanity is venturing out into the stars. And that's because that's the nature of the conflict that I wanted to explore. Not necessarily the war, but the conflict, which, and in the Honorverse, it's primarily human on human because that's the only people we have to fight with. Okay, if we had somebody else, we'd fight with them too. But I put a line into Honor's dialogue in the last book that really kind of sums up my view of history. The two things that human beings make are tools and mistakes. Okay, we get stuff right too. Okay, but that's what makes us who and what we are.
yeah.
And the mistakes that we make are the tragedy of our nature, but it is in triumphing over those mistakes that we achieve the greatest stature that we have, I think, as human beings. Eric's right. Okay, the thing that makes us different from any other species on the planet, and it could be that this is a necessary consequence of evolving a certain level of intelligence and so forth, is the fact that we cannot exist as a non-social group.
Yeah, that's our
No,
power.
we don't even. No, we don't. Yeah.
That and
Yeah, well, but see, okay, almost every critter out there, okay, is a member of a group. Okay, humans have to be able to extend that group in a way that other species don't. And part of the reason for that is we have the capacity to interact with one another in a way that other species don't. Okay, and the fact that we, like every other species, compete for resources, compete for space, compete for everything else, means that we have to, because we're capable of developing better ways to compete, okay, we have to band together as social groups to not get out-competed by the group down the street. It's like Heinlein says in Starship Troopers, mankind can decide it ain't going to study war no more, and it'll last until the next group comes along that is still willing to study war. That's also true in interhuman groups. And I think it's the tragedy of people who say that they would never resort to violence. They can only exist on the sufferance of people who will resort to violence to protect them.
Right about that.
Yeah. Well, Poul Anderson, in one of the Flandry's novels, I think Ensign Flandry, has a senior officer tell Flandry, he says, people talk with admiration of people who say they would never resort to violence, even in self-defense. He said, I don't. Because in effect, what they have done is they have said, I will not resort to violence even to stop evil. And I think that is one, and I had already started writing before I found that particular Anderson novel. But I think it sums up a lot of my own philosophy, that if you do not oppose evil by whatever means you can, you become complicit in the evil because you are allowing it free reign. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things. Eric and I, there's certain characteristics that Eric and my good guys have in common. We already talked a little bit about that, the fact that we both write about people who are responsibility takers. I think we also both try to write about people who actually look at their life decisions as opposed to just coasting. I think that if you find, I think you'll find, Eric, I think that you'll find that neither of us has a lot of use for fellow travelers of any political stripe.
No.
Okay. Or not just political stripe, philosophical stripe, moral stripe, whatever you want to call it, whatever motivates someone to be who they are. Okay. We want you to own who you are and to take responsibility for being who you are. And not just sort of, okay, whatever, on your way through life. That's what we find
To me,
admirable in somebody.
To me,
Sorry?
Go ahead, Dave.
No, I was good. You.
Well, to me, it's just an issue of integrity. It's, if you're not, I don't know how to put it. To go back a little bit earlier, what you were saying, the thing that I think people have to understand is that we are a social animal, and we are far more social than well, unless you want to start comparing us to ants or insects, and that's just a foolish comparison.
There, you Marxist! I knew you were going there.
No, it's just foolish because it's completely different. But one of the points, for instance, that Stephen Jay Gould once made, biologist, and he's a great explainer of biology. He said, what people don't really grasp is that human beings are far and away the least violent mammals around, or for that matter, any other animal. He said, very rare. He says, rabbits are more violent to each other than human beings are. And that's true. But what people also need to understand is that built into the very reality of being a social animal, xenophobia is built into that, because in order to define yourself as us, there has to be some other out there you're defining yourself against. And
I think that I would say it's less the case that there has to be someone else out there that you're defining yourself against, as it is that when you meet someone who doesn't fit the group that is defined as us, whether you needed a template to form against or not, you kind of automatically have one when you meet another competing social group that isn't you, that doesn't have your values and whatnot.
Well, I agree with that. What happens is we become more civilized.
Yeah.
A couple of things happen. First of all, there are many, many, many levels start accreting of who us is and who them are. Don't forget, every human being belongs to many different us's. There's us, the Americans, and then there's us, the Yankee fans, and then there's us, the this, and us, the that.
There are no Yankee fans. Yankee fans are not human.
No, I know they're not.
Okay, I just thought I'd mention that.
I'm a Dodger fan. I mean, the Yankees.
Okay, there's some lines we got to draw.
I know some lines you absolutely have to draw, but the other thing that happens is that it also just gets more and more sophisticated. What's us and what's them, so it stops being so completely personalized as those guys. And I think we get better at it, but it takes a while. But the thing I keep saying to people is, you're going to take a position on what you think the human race is. You have to have the right yardstick, and the yardstick is not one lifetime or even a century or two. 5,000 years ago, there were not many civilized places on the face of the earth, and they were spending an incredible amount of their time and energy piling rocks together in order to bury one guy or to build a temple for, and today we can see almost to the edge of the universe and almost back to the beginning of time. Half the human species at least lives lives of pretty good self-determination. Most of the ones who don't have a great deal of it. I mean, take a country that we think of as being very autocratic, which it is, like China. Yeah, it's very autocratic, but here's what else is true. There are so many Chinese tourists in the world that my Moroccan, when Lou and I were in Morocco 2 years ago, our Moroccan guide told us that he was learning Chinese. And if you got that many people in China who can tour the world and come and study in the United States and go back, okay, this is still an autocratic society, but it's not as autocratic as medieval Europe was.
Well, it's kind of like unless you're in one of the at best facade democracy capitalist states, if you look at your citizenry today as opposed to the citizenry of even England in Edwardian times, okay, yes, there's huge concentration of power and wealth in the upper group, but there's so much more power and wealth that the part that isn't concentrated spreads so much farther. And there's also the fact that, like it or not, we are a species of expanding expectations. And we certainly have been since the Renaissance. Before the Renaissance, you were going to be much more likely to see a world situation in which I was born a peasant, I'll die a peasant, etc. What is frequently overlooked by a bunch of what I think of as modern day Luddites is that technology, for all of the problems that it's created, is also what has created the healthiest, longest lived, best educated, materially best provided for human civilization in history. And I used to do a panel, I'm thinking about doing it again at cons, where the first question is, how many people in the audience are diabetics? I get hands to go up.
Yeah.
I can ask 20 questions and I have practically every hand in the audience up, and then I can say, congratulations, in a pre-technic society, you're all dead. Okay. And that's where we are. Okay. It's kind of like this whole thing about genetically modified organisms. Okay. Dr. Malthus ran into genetically modified organisms, the wheat crops that we can grow and whatnot today. Now you can make the case that, well, we could probably solve the problem too if we didn't multiply like rabbits, but we don't multiply like rabbits, and population curves are starting to level.
It's purely a matter of wealth.
I think so.
The birth rate of these people screaming about Muslim immigrants in France, the birth rate in North Africa is lower than the birth rate in France. And the reason is simple. Every immigrant group is mostly young people, so naturally they breed like rabbits. They're childbearing age, But you let one more generation go by and it's going to stabilize to whatever that society is. That's what happens every time. And yeah, you give a society wealth, evercation, and make sure women have access to birth control, and the birth rate will drop like a stone. It happens.
And another side of it is that as we get superior technological tools, we need less hands.
Right.
And not only that, you don't lose as many of them in infancy.
Yeah.
In Western thinking today, it's a tragedy for a parent to bury a child. It's not supposed to be that way. It's supposed to go the other way. That's the way it goes. That's the way it's supposed to be. If you walk into any cemetery that's been there for 100 years, the just lines of graves that may just have a stone with nothing even engraved on it, where babies and young children were buried, gives you a sobering perspective. And here's one for you. The guy who built Biltmore House, okay, he died at like 34 or 35 of appendicitis.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And you think about that today, it's like, well, he died of appendicitis. Okay, I walked around with a ruptured appendix for 11 days and lived. Okay, and without modern medicine, I would be dead. All right, gone. That's all there is to it.
My grandfather, go ahead, David.
Go get what you can do.
I was just going to say, my maternal grandfather, I never knew him because he died at the age of 32 when my mother was, God, she was 8, I think. And what happened was he slipped on the ice and broke his collarbone, which by itself, I broke my collarbone once.
I've done that. Yes.
You know, when I was a kid, I was hiking in the mountains with some, you know, and rock filling me. What happened was the doctor told me he had to get bed rest. So he lay in bed for 2 weeks and developed pneumonia. And pneumonia killed him. This is before he had antibiotics. He didn't have any penicillin.
Well, one difference today between the flupocalypse and 1918. I mean, I did the math, and I think that for the flupocalypse to be as bad, somebody told me this is as bad as 1918. And I said, okay, we'd have to lose like 70 million people for it to be as bad as 1918.
Sure.
But one of the huge differences is the palliative care that we have for people who get sick. That just wasn't available in 1918.
And it's gotten better. I mean, since the, you know, just in a few months, if you're fortunate enough to get it now, you've got quite a bit better chance of surviving. Than
you have a hugely better chance. Yeah. Well, and it's kind of like,
I still don't want to get it.
Oh, I'm perfectly fine not having it. You know,
we just still don't know what kind of long-term effect.
No, that's not something. Have you read? I think the title is The Great Influenza Epidemic. It's about 12 years old now.
The Great what?
The Great Influenza. It's about 12 years old now. But the guy who wrote it is a specialist in pandemics. And he starts with the founding of Johns Hopkins University, because what he's viewing this is as the first time modern medicine went up against a pandemic. And he says modern medicine got its butt kicked.
Yeah.
But he's not very kind to Woodrow Wilson in this book. And he's still kinder to him than he deserves. But he made the point. He says, you know who probably the most influential what was the most single influential consequence of the 1918 influenza? Woodrow Wilson. He thinks Wilson had it at Versailles. And one of you made me think about this with the long-term consequences. A lot of people who recovered from the 1918 influenza epidemic were never what they were before they had it. They weren't as sharp. Yeah. And he says, okay, so here's Wilson. He's at Versailles. He's got these principles that he's fighting for, and then he's sick for like a week and a half. And in one day, Lloyd George and Clemenceau got him to agree to everything he'd opposed in the punitive terms in return for the League of Nations. And from there on, he was like obsessing over how much mileage the cars assigned to the American delegation were running up and so forth. And then, of course, he has his stroke and is incapacitated. He thinks that Wilson suffered from the influenza epidemic of 1918, and that a lot of the conditions that led to a lot of the preconditions for World War II might have been avoided had he not been impaired by his experience with his having the influenza epidemic. And I'm not sufficiently versed on the medical side of it to know one way or the other. He makes a convincing case, as far as I can see, for that.
Certainly plausible.
Yeah,
it is.
And that's one of the reasons why I love history. Is the things that you find if you go looking that are just like God writing his own novel. Okay. Now I think that, he's probably a little more hands off than that. Unless you're watching Supernatural right now, which Sharon is, and Chuck is God I don't know. I haven't seen it. But I would love, I'd like to live to be 150 and be clear as a bell anyway, but I'd like to live to be 150 and read the equivalent of that history of the 1918 influenza epidemic, looking at the 2020 pandemic.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure that it's going to be different. Hello, dog. Sorry, she's back again.
It's okay. We've all been laughing at James's dog in the background for a while.
Hello. No, we're not going in yet.
So, David, I promised the first Space Lord that I would ask you this question. She wants to know when Honor's going to take her job over her.
You want to know what?
It's when Honor's going to become first Space Lord. Not for probably at least 15 years of her time, unless things get very strange. Honor didn't realize, really, until after she lost Paul, how much of her life she'd put on hold because of her career and in part because of her reactions to Pavel. And it took really Emily more than anybody else to really show her what she, more even than her mom. Okay, now I think that if her mom had had the twins earlier in Honor's life, it might have shaped her perspective a little more. But she has discovered the parenthood that she had denied herself. And I will go ahead and say motherhood, even though that has baggage that people like, oh, limiting factor, et cetera. Well, so does fatherhood. If you embrace that role, you limit what you can do. And the more fully you embrace that role, the more you limit the other things that you can do. And it's, trust me, as the father of 3, my God, I can't think of anything I'd rather have done with my time. Honor is determined that she's going to do that. And because she has prolonged, she has time to do that. And I think a lot of people didn't really realize until Emily died how much Emily meant to Honor. Because there wasn't a good way to show you that until I took it away from her. And Emily, I got somebody who looked at me very strangely when Emily was talking to Allison. She's talking about, of course he fell in love with her. And she says, more or less, if I weren't stuck in this wheelchair, so would I. And people are like, wait, what was that? I'm like, okay, you do realize that Allison's from Beowulf on this whole thing. It's not a problem for her. But, and that's one thing. I've had some people who have fussed at me about, you haven't done enough about this and you haven't done enough about that, where sexuality and whatnot is concerned in the books and where gender determination and so forth is determined in the books. When it's significant to the character or the story, you'll see it. And when it's not, you won't. A lot of people don't realize that I introduced you because it was never germane, so I never found a place to put it. I introduced you to a gay character back in the Short Victorious War. Mark Sarnow's gay. You've just never met his husband because it wasn't germane. Okay. And I'm sorry. That's the way I write. It's kind of like that whole thing about the AI. People are like, there's no AI in the universe. And I'm saying, what are you talking about? It's everywhere. And they say, no, it's not. I said, you think you steer a starship with a joystick without having a whole bunch of AI buried in there? Give me a freaking break.
Can't have my characters.
It's like John Campbell said about light switches. He said, most Americans, they flip a light switch. They have no idea what's connected to that light switch. It's magic. They turn it on, the lights come on. There's no copper wire connected to the other side of it. There's not a generating plant somewhere 50 miles down the road. Okay,
they don't on the other side of that thing. Copper, good.
Well, it's magic. Okay, and that's in the Honorverse. Thinking about AI is significant here for us thinking about what's on the other side of the light switch.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Okay.
I understand. Look, you let me have expanding rooms, so I'm not going to complain about the about the license. I'm not going to complain much. Anyway.
Oh yeah, sure you're not. Yeah,
So James Sene has a question.
Yes.
Okay, this is for you, David, and this is a fairly recurring question. So years ago when you brought us House of Lies, or not House of Lies, God, back up. House of Steel. I will get it right. House of Steel. There was going to be a couple other companion books, House of Lies, House of Shadows.
Yes.
Do we know when the next one is going to get published?
I can give you a very precise date. Eventually.
Awesome.
We've been hearing eventually for a long time.
I know. And part of the problem is other people's schedules. Part of the problem is my schedule. And part of the problem is that I genuinely, seriously, guys, have lost about 2.5 years of writing time because of that stupid accident in Atlanta.
Yep. We understand. It's just I have to ask on occasion.
Yeah, well, okay. I've actually done a portion of my part of House of Lies. The equivalent in House of Lies of I Will Build My House of Steel is going to be, unless something very strange happens, an anthology of short stories that will be tied together.
And we've seen some of them?
Yes and no. But Our Sacred Honor is definitely part of it.
Yeah. So
Essentially, eventually, and possibly in this next anthology that is going to be coming out sometime in the next 18 months or so from Baen. A lot of people don't realize, because I haven't told you, so obviously you can't realize, Tom Theismann and Javier Giscard went on their midshipman cruises together. And the officer overseeing them was Alfredo Yu. And that's how long they have known each other. And Alfredo Yu counseled both of them on how to stay under the radar with their how we say, non-party thoughts. So what I want to do is to do a group of short stories that will start early in the career of Theismann, of Giscard, and of
Alfredo.
No, not Alfredo, but this is one of the things that has happened since the headache.
Richard.
I can't think of names. Our president, Eloise Pritchard. Yeah. And it will end with Pritchard walking into Theismann's office and finding out that he wants her to be the first president of the restored republic. So it will follow them all the way up and through. Now, at some point, and I may actually borrow Victor in part to figure this out, and we may actually, Eric, need to kind of touch on this in the current book. Mm-hmm. At some point, it will be discovered that the bargain that caused the collapse of the original Republic of Haven, that Duquesne, of the famous Duquesne plan, okay, he was part of the alignment, mm-hmm. and he was an alpha. And the entire purpose of the Duquesne plan was to destabilize and delegitimize the Republic of Haven, because the Republic of Haven was the major pole outside the Solarian League that could have posed a threat to the alignment. And so they evoked the Star Kingdom of Manticore, which is what has upset their apple cart, because their plan to take down the Republic of Haven worked too well.
In my grandmother's favorite saying, they were too smart for their own good. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know, the other side of it is you make the mistake of projecting results without allowing for chaos,
right?
To chaos theory, to take a hand in it. And I don't know where we're going to put that, but it's one of the things that needs to be established, unpacked for the reader at some point. It's been baked into the DNA of the series from the beginning, as far as I was
losing
concerned.
track of that Harrington line.
Yeah, that was a boo. Well, see, eventually in the Star Kingdom novels that I'm doing with Jane, you'll find out exactly how that happened.
Yeah.
And okay, is everybody who's left okay with spoilers? Okay. Stephanie Harrington becomes an orphan because of the alignment. And she doesn't know it. But what happens is that she has a cousin, her father's cousin, who is a member of the alignment way back home. And when the alignment finds out about the tree cats, they send him out to be their frontman. Now he's more or less still, Eric, this is still when the malign alignment and the benign alignment, they've only just really started separating, kind of thing. And he arrives and says something which causes Honor's dad, who was not part of the alignment, to say, that's interesting. I never thought about when that turned up in the line. I'm going to have to do some research. So he's inadvertently launched his cousin, who he loves dearly, into a path that will almost inevitably lead to the discovery of the alignment. And so he arranges for his cousin's death and accidentally gets Steph's mother too. And he's horrified that this quote had to be done and that he did it. But that's where the line between the alignment and the Harrington link is broken. And he tries real hard to convince Stephanie to come home, kind of thing. Come home with me. You don't have anybody here. You can bring, Lionheart with you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And first of all, she's not going to take Lionheart away, but also by then she has discovered that she is in love with somebody whose name is Carl. So she says, this is my home. And that's why the Harrington surname survives instead of they're becoming the Zavonics. Is her determination that her father and mother's name, and her mom's pregnant when she dies too, just to make life perfect. But Stephanie's only about 19 when that happens, so I don't know whether or not we'll get to that in the story arc. But that's how that whole thing happened. And of course, what Honor represents is a very early alpha. In some ways, the alphas who are running around today are improvements on her, but there's a reason why the alignment tailors some genetic mixes, but leaves it up to natural selection for others. Okay, and the Harrington line, the alpha line, boy, would they love to have everything that's crept into that one interwoven into the current alignment. Ultimately, possibly, Honor's mom is going to figure out that Honor is an alpha, because there's the game plan right now calls for her to develop a test to tag genetic modifications made by the alignment, the techniques and that leave fingerprints behind. And she'll realize when she applies, when she finds the fingerprint, she'll realize that fingerprint exists in Alfred and Honor's DNA. But by that time, Eric, what we're doing on Mesa with the difference between the benign and the malign alignment becoming known will also be part of the calculus for the folks in the Grand Alliance. It's going to be interesting to me because I don't know yet how it's going to work out, that we're dealing with people who were genetically modified but who were never evil or anything else. What is the stigma against them going to be once we find out that the malign alignment actually existed? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and you, in the books, you have occasionally mentioned a stigma against, quote, genies.
Yeah, that's an
And
existing
so
stigma.
there's that already
Yeah.
in the canon of of the books.
Well, see, one of the things that needs to be unpacked in here, and we're actually, Eric and I are moving on that in this book more overtly than I have before, is the fact that the alignment wasn't wrong. Okay, about what applying genetics to improving the human genome could accomplish. By the same token, the concerns that the original founders of the Beowulf Code had of some sort of stratification of human beings based on what we know their genes are is also a valid thought, a valid concern. So these are some of the issues that I want to look at in the books going forward. The Beowulf codes were a reaction against the genetic modifications that had been so pivotal in Earth's final war, but they were also on the part of the folks on Beowulf, at least. Look, we've gotten past the point where we believe, in racial inferiority, racial superiority. We recognize that it was a vicious myth that we used to stratify ourselves. Why in God's name would we want to put one right back in where we can look at someone's genetic map and say, this person is demonstrably superior for certain values of superior?
Or inferior.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I said, that I was raised what passed for hard left in the 1960s by a mother from the suburbs of Cleveland and a father who was blue-collar Chicago family and whose father had been blacklisted in 2 different trades before he finally got one unionized and they couldn't kick him out. That's basically the way that it worked.
Listen, Oscar Mayer tried to fire me 3 times.
Yeah.
And they couldn't make it stick, but if it had been non-union, I would have been out the door.
Well, okay. He started out as a butcher,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and was trying to unionize the meatpacking houses and got run out for that. So then he was a mason, and and he got run out for that. And then he became an electrician, and they got the electricians unionized before they could fire him. That side of the family, I got Wobblies, I got bunches and bunches of your kind of guys, kind of thing. But the thing that I cannot ever get past, ever, is what Martin Luther King said about how we're supposed to judge people. And he was not the first to say it. He was the guy who said it the most eloquently in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. And who made it stick even at the cost of his own life. And that is that we're supposed to be judged by the content of our characters and not the color of our skin or any other external. I think I said on Facebook not too long ago, race is literally skin deep. Okay? And it's what that skin is wrapped around that matters. And that's one of the things that I try to touch on in my writing, and that is really specifically what I'm looking at here, why I went there in the first place with the Mason alignment. And Eric here with the Audubon Ballroom and other certain appurtenances that have been added to it has touched on the fact that whether I like it or not, Mao was right. That ultimately power does come from the muzzle of a gun.
I don't actually. I think Mao. Well, I don't know how to put this. I feel the same way about that statement by Mao as I do by a statement somewhat similar by Heinlein, which is that violence has settled more things in history than anything else. It's in Starship Troopers. And the problem is that it's facile. It's true. But here's what else is true. Violence has not settled more things in history than anything else, too. And I will ask people to argue with me. I said, well, what did the Mantuan War settle? And they'll stare at me. And I said, oh, you never heard of the Mantuan War. of 1630 to 1632 that depopulated a fourth of the population of northern Italy. You never even heard of it because it didn't settle a goddamn thing. What did the war in Spain between Spain and France of 1634 to 1659? What did that settle? And they'll stare at me. I say, yeah, of course you never heard of it.
Yeah.
4 little towns changed hands from Spain to France. That's what it changed.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the point is we remember the wars that where something important did happen. And there have been wars like that, Civil War, World War II. But there are so many wars that just, Jesus Christ.
Okay, but what you're saying is not that violence hasn't settled more things than any other means. What you're saying is that violence doesn't always settle things.
No.
And I understand precisely what you're saying. Piper in Lord Calvin, one of Calvin's history professors, taught him military history because no great change. I can't remember exactly how he put it. I'm not saying I 100% agree with this, but I think there's definitely a germ of truth to it. He says no great change really counts until it's ratified on the field of battle.
Yeah, that's from Lord Calvin of 101.
Yeah. But I think that
here's the problem with that, David.
Yeah. This is the
but
kind of conversations we have.
Say no verdict rendered on the field of battle really counts until it consolidates in a peace that lasts or into a state of affairs that lasts. Because,
I would agree.
Let's not forget that it was Germany that lost in 1918, and that
there was an unfortunate consequence of that.
I know, no kidding. Here's my only point about it is just that there are a lot of Mao's statement reminds me of Stalin's about how many divisions does the
Pope have? Yes.
Well, the Pope outlived, the papacy at least has outlived Stalin and his legacy.
And a lot of other people along the way.
And a lot of other people along the line. And so it's the most outstanding characteristic to me of autocratic societies, at least in modern industrial civilizations, is how brittle and fragile they are. I mean,
agree.
The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. Stalinism, I counted from 1929. You want to go back to 1917? Fine. Either way, you're talking less than a century for Christ.
Yeah. I'm like 50 years. I think that where I'm not using Mao's, it's kind of like when we're talking about Cromwell's quote earlier.
Yeah.
Okay. What I'm saying that where Mao was correct is that, or to put it another way, the pen may be mightier than the sword.
Yeah.
At any given moment, the sword speaks louder with more finality.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
No,
and that's what I meant by that.
No, look, I am no pacifist. It was part of my difficulty when I argued for conscientious objector status during the Vietnam War, was that I did it because I was pissed off, because the law was, I think it's probably still on the books, that to be a conscientious objector, 2 conditions had to apply. You had to be a pacifist, that as opposed to all war, which I wasn't. But it had to be for religious reasons.
I don't think it still has to be for religious reasons.
I don't know, but it did in those days, and you couldn't just go in and say it's your no. You have to show that it's. And a friend of mine, the rotten dog, got his pastor to write that he was a conscientious objector, even though he wasn't a believer any longer. But he took that.
I love the guy who was a conscientious objector. When they asked him what the church was, he said the Church of Satan. And they said, not violent. He said, of course not. We can't afford to be violent. They turn the Christians against us again. We're all dead meat. Didn't work, but it was worth a try.
But I want to I don't want to interrupt you guys, and you're welcome to stay because we're here.
Well, if it's midnight my time, it's what?
It's after 11 o'clock my time, so I don't want to interrupt. I mean, you're welcome to stay.
No, I got to
We
go.
probably should call it quits. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
My
It was
wife
fun though.
But
Oh,
thank
yeah,
you
it was a lot of
thank
fun.
you both for coming. It's been fabulous. We
Yeah.
love listening to you. I mean, you guys could go on all night. We'd stay here.
But I
We've
just
done
ask
that.
I would like to ask one favor before I go. I would appreciate it if you would all publicize the Ring of Fire convention.
So I've already posted that on the,
Yep.
the View Plan events page and on the TRM announcements page and in the forums.
Great. Thank you very
Yep.
much.
And we'll do it.
Remember
We'll
to
do it
eat your supper.
again.
Yeah.
Yes, well,
we
that's-
actually put
that's on my
together a hell of
list.
a collection of guests. We got David Brin, Misty Lackey, Nancy Kress, David Gerald, a whole bunch of people are coming to it.
Yep.
Yeah, we'll absolutely promote that for you.
Yeah, in
Good.
fact, there
Thank
was
you
some
very
in
much.
the
I
chat-
appreciate
Eric, drop me another email or IM with the link in it, would you?
it. Say that again.
Drop me another email or another IM with the link that I can share to Facebook afresh.
Oh, okay,
Do
fine.
that? Yep. Okay.
Yeah, you mean a link to the convention? Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
I'll get that out to you.
Okay.
Yeah, we will definitely continue to publicize that for you, Eric. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I
Yeah.
appreciate it. For one
You know,
thing, not a lot of people there, but beyond that, one
I
thing
hate.
about these virtual conventions, they're more expensive than you think too.
Yeah.
Well,
Oh, we
they,
know.
they
You're in
are,
for
but
MantiCon.
I'll tell you something. Much as I miss travel and face to face and all the rest of it, I think we're going to see more and more of this
Oh, yeah.
in fandom, just like we're going to see it in business.
Mhm.
I'll
I'm
tell
not
you
sure.
one thing I've discovered, David, from organizing this thing, and I've now been on a lot of panels
Mhm.
and moderate way more than I like to be because I think people are going to get sick of my face. But I actually find these panels better than ones in molecular conventions because you're actually getting a conversation between the panelists, whereas when you get everybody sitting at a table, in a row, it's more like you've got 5 or 6 individuals all talking at the audience. And
I think that's part of it, but I think another part of it is that the virtual panels tend to be smaller in terms
yes,
of
they
the
do.
guests.
Yeah, they do. We've kept ours to, I think we had one, we just had one that had 6 people. That's because there was a screw up.
Mhm.
Other than that, we've kept them all to 5 or less.
And I think also the way that it's set up with an electronic moderator fielding the questions and then presenting them gives a greater degree of participation than when you got to raise your hand and see whether or
Yeah, I
not
know.
you get recognized.
We're
Yep.
not doing that because we've thought about that, but to trying to do a whole convention, we've got something like 50 some odd events happening.
Yeah, you need an awful lot of
Trying to
moderators.
organize that, we just realized that's a bridge too far. So what we're doing instead is every day, the end of the day, there'll be a live interaction between the guests and the audience, and where people can participate. And we'll do it as in breakout rooms, where
Nice.
these authors will be over here. Go whoever you want to talk to, go ahead and do it. We'll see how that works. There's a lot of experimentation in this thing, but it's interesting, that's for sure. It's just I'm freaking too damn old to be learning new skill sets. Damn it! I mean, they're making me do it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh,
Kicking and screaming into the 21st century, eh, Eric?
Yeah, and I wasn't real happy with the 20th.
Oh,
All
David,
right.
sound.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and please feel free to
Eric,
do
we
it again.
appreciate you being here, absolutely, and we'd love to have you come back anytime.
I will
So,
be glad to anytime.
thank you.
Well, not anytime.
Well-
Not for a month. I gotta get back to Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right,
Take care.
Thanks again, you guys.
Thank you for
Yeah.
stopping by.
thanks.
Good night.
Good night.
go eat, David, and take your doggy out.
All right.
And
Okay.
Eric, stay alive.
I will. All right. I'm out. Goodbye.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.
All right.